Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of history's most nightmarish workplaces. A medieval battlefield medic tent. Picture this. You're standing in a canvas structure barely holding together against the wind. The floor beneath you is trampled mud mixed with blood that never quite dries, and the air is thick with the metallic tang of fresh wounds combined with the sweet, rotting smell of infections that have been festering for days. The screaming is constant, not the dramatic, movie-style screaming. No, this is the raw, animalistic howling of men who've just realized their leg is gone or that the gash across their abdomen means they'll be dead by morning. You're not watching this on a screen. You're in it, and someone just handed you a blood-crusted apron and told you to get to work. Now, here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't last until the first amputation. We like to think we're tough, that we could handle the grit and gore of medieval warfare. But the truth is, modern sensibilities are no match for the relentless horror of a 13th century field hospital. You've got no antibiotics, no anesthesia worth mentioning, and certainly no understanding of germ theory because that won't be discovered for another 600 years. Every decision you make is based on a medical system rooted in ancient Greek philosophy, Catholic mysticism, and sheer desperate guesswork. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our little global community of history nerds and insomniacs coming together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at the medic tent on a gray morning in October 1346, somewhere in northern France. The Battle of Crécy happened yesterday, and the aftermath is somehow worse than the fighting itself. English longbowmen spent hours turning French knights into pincushions, and now the wounded are flooding in from both sides. Though let's be honest, the victors get slightly better treatment. The tent is one of several hastily erected structures behind the English lines, far enough from the battlefield that you're not in immediate danger, but close enough that you can still hear the occasional scream from soldiers being dispatched on the field where they fell. Your medical team consists of a grizzled barber surgeon named Thomas who lost 2 fingers to a battlefield accident years ago, a monk named Brother Aldrich who's convinced that prayer is more effective than any earthly remedy, and a handful of camp followers, women who travel with armies cooking, mending, and yes, dealing with the wounded. Nobody here went to medical school. Thomas learned his trade cutting hair and pulling teeth. Brother Aldrich read some texts by Galen and spent time in a monastery infirmary. The women learned by doing, which honestly makes them the most practically experienced of the bunch. The first thing that hits you, beyond the smell which will return to constantly because you never get used to it, is the noise. Forget the peaceful image of caregivers moving quietly between beds. This is chaos. Men are crying for their mothers in 3 different languages. Someone's arguing loudly about whether a particular knight deserves treatment before a common soldier. A boy who can't be more than 15 is sitting in the corner, rocking back and forth, his face blank with shock, his hands still gripping the sword he doesn't remember dropping. Thomas is already elbow-deep in someone's chest cavity, trying to pull out an arrowhead that broke off beneath the ribs. Stop gawking and make yourself useful. He barks at you in Middle English that you barely understand. He points toward a row of men lying on straw pallets. Start with water. They're all bleeding dry from the inside. Get them drinking. You grab a wooden bucket and a ladle. Simple enough, right? Except the water came from a stream that's currently running red with blood and the runoff from a few thousand unwashed soldiers camping upstream. The bucket itself hasn't been properly cleaned since, well, probably never. You're about to serve up a nice cocktail of battlefield contamination, but nobody here knows that bacteria exists, so everyone thinks you're doing great work. The first soldier you approach is missing his left hand. The stump is wrapped in cloth that was probably beige at some point, but is now rust brown with dried blood. His face is the color of old parchment, slick with fever sweat. When you offer him water, he gulps it desperately, and for a moment you feel helpful. Then he vomits it back up, along with what looks like coffee grounds but is actually partially digested blood from internal injuries you can't see. He's bleeding inside, and there's absolutely nothing anyone in this tent can do about it. Brother Aldrich will pray over him later. By evening, he'll be added to the cart of corpses. Medieval battlefield medicine operated on principles that seem almost comically wrong to us now. The human body, they believed, was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease and injury resulted from these humors becoming unbalanced. Too much blood? You needed bloodletting. An infection causing heat? That was excess yellow bile, and you'd better get some of that bile out through induced vomiting or diarrhea. The idea that tiny invisible organisms could invade your body and kill you would have sounded like witchcraft. Here's something that might surprise you. Medieval medics weren't complete idiots. They'd accumulated centuries of practical knowledge through trial and error. They knew that certain herbs reduced pain: opium poppies, mandrake, henbane. They understood that major bleeding needed to be stopped quickly with pressure or cauterization. They'd figured out that some wounds healed better when kept clean, even if they didn't understand why. Surgeons like Thomas had genuine anatomical knowledge from treating thousands of injuries. But all of this practical wisdom was embedded in a theoretical framework so fundamentally flawed that it undermined everything they tried to do. You move to the next patient, and this is where your modern sensibilities really start to fail you. This man took a mace to the side of his head. His skull is visibly dented, and there's a crater in his temple about the size of a plum. Bone fragments are visible in the wound. Fluid that definitely isn't supposed to be outside his head is leaking down his cheek. He's conscious, barely, and trying to talk, but the words come out as slurred nonsense. Thomas glances over. "Trepanation," he says matter-of-factly. "We'll drill the pressure out." You watch as he pulls out what looks like a carpentry drill with a curved bit. The plan, you're learning, is to drill holes in this man's skull to release the evil humors building up from the injury. Historians still argue whether medieval trepanation did more harm than good, but evidence from excavated skulls shows that some patients actually survived the procedure. You can tell because the bone shows signs of healing around the drill holes. This guy, though, with his brain already damaged, bone fragments driven inward, and the inevitable infection that'll set in, he's living on borrowed hours. One of the camp followers, a woman named Marjorie who's probably seen more battlefield trauma than most knights, is preparing the space for the procedure. She's laying out tools on a blood-stained cloth. The drill, a small saw, a scalpel that's essentially a sharpened knife, and several curved needles with thread made from animal gut. None of it has been sterilized because, again, nobody knows what sterilization is. Between uses, tools get wiped on someone's apron and maybe rinsed in that questionable water. You're basically watching a medical team prepare to introduce bacteria directly into a man's brain. You'll hold his head still, Thomas tells you, not asks, tells. Before you can process this, Brother Aldrich is positioning himself at the man's feet, beginning a Latin prayer. The patient seems to understand what's about to happen and starts thrashing weakly. Two other soldiers who've already been treated, one missing half his teeth from a face wound, another with his arm splinted, move in to help restrain him. This is your team. This is your anesthesia department. Human restraint and prayer. The drill touches skull, and the sound it makes, a grinding, scratching sound mixed with a wet crunch, is something you'll hear in nightmares for years, assuming you survive the day. The patient's screaming becomes somehow more urgent, more primal. His eyes roll back. You're holding his head as still as you can, but he's convulsing, and you can feel the wrongness of it all through your hands, the way the skull shifts slightly under your grip, the way the warmth of his blood soaks through the cloth someone placed under his head. Here's a fun fact that'll help you never sleep peacefully again. Medieval surgeons often worked fast not because they were skilled, but because they had to finish before the patient died of shock. Speed was valued over precision. Thomas isn't carefully deliberating each turn of the drill. He's going as fast as he can while still maintaining control, racing against the clock of human consciousness. The drill breaks through. There's a visible release of pressure, fluid and blood oozing out of the new hole. Thomas makes 2 more holes, forming a triangle around the impact site. The patient has stopped screaming. He's either unconscious or dead. You genuinely can't tell which. Brother Aldrich is still praying, his voice steady, apparently unbothered by the fact that he's participating in what your modern mind recognizes as torture disguised as treatment. "Good," Thomas says, wiping his hands on his already filthy apron. "Bandage him. Next." Just like that. No checking for pulse, no monitoring vitals, no post-operative observation. The man is dragged to a corner of the tent where other treated patients lie in various states of consciousness. Some will recover. Many won't. There's no way to predict which is which because the factors that determine survival, infection, brain damage, blood loss, shock, are invisible to medieval eyes. You've been in the tent for maybe an hour. You've served contaminated water, helped drill holes in a man's skull, and been splattered with more bodily fluids than you've probably encountered in your entire modern life. Your hands are shaking. The smell has somehow gotten worse as the day warms up, cooking the various biological horrors into a thick atmosphere that coats your throat. And here's the thing. This is a relatively calm moment. The battle was yesterday. The initial wave of casualties has been processed. What you're seeing now is maintenance, treating the overflow, managing the infected wounds that are developing, dealing with the men who seemed fine yesterday but are starting to show signs of internal bleeding or organ failure. When the battle is actually raging, when fresh wounded are being carried in every few minutes, when you're trying to stop arterial bleeding on 3 men simultaneously while someone screams that a nobleman needs immediate attention, when the tent fills with smoke because someone knocked over a brazier used for heating cautery irons, that's when the real horror unfolds. Thomas is already calling you over to the next patient. This one's conscious and terrified, staring at his own leg, which is bent at an angle legs shouldn't bend. The broken bone has pierced through the skin, a compound fracture. In your time, this is serious but treatable. Antibiotics, surgery, pins, months of physical therapy. Here, Thomas is eyeing it and making calculations you don't want to hear. "Might save it," he mutters. "Might not. The humors will decide." That's your medical prognosis. The humors will decide. Not skill, not treatment, not careful intervention. The invisible, non-existent humors flowing through this man's body will determine whether he keeps his leg or loses it to infection, whether he lives or dies, whether he'll ever walk again or spend his remaining days begging on a church step. Welcome to medieval battlefield medicine, where everything you know is wrong, every instinct you have will be ignored, and every day is a fresh education in human suffering that you're utterly unprepared to handle. The sun is barely at its peak. You have hours to go. And that screaming you hear starting up again? Someone just regained consciousness after an amputation. You'll be meeting him shortly. Thomas wipes his hands on his apron. A gesture you're realizing is his version of preparing for surgery, and walks you over to what he calls his instruments. You've been picturing something organized, maybe a wooden case with compartments, tools laid out with some semblance of order. Instead, you're looking at a stained canvas roll tied with leather cord, bulging with metal shapes, and a wooden box that looks like it survived a fire. When Thomas unrolls the canvas on a blood-splattered table, you're confronted with what can only be described as a torture implement collection that occasionally moonlights as medical equipment. The centerpiece is a bone saw. It's about the length of your forearm, with a curved blade that's been sharpened so many times the metal has worn thin in places. The teeth are uneven, some broken off, others bent, and there's a dark residue in the grooves that nobody has bothered to clean out. This saw has been through hundreds of limbs, and it shows. Next to it lies an assortment of knives in various sizes, from delicate blades meant for precise cuts to heavy choppers that look more suited to butchering livestock, which, let's be honest, isn't far from what they're used for here. The arrows are the worst, Thomas says conversationally, picking up a peculiar instrument that looks like narrow tongs with a screw mechanism. Barbed broadheads. They go in easy but won't come out. Sometimes you have to push them through. Sometimes you dig around. Sometimes, he shrugs, you just leave them in and hope the body pushes them out on its own. That last option sounds insane until you remember that digging around in a wound with unsterilized instruments might actually be worse than leaving the foreign object in place. Accidentally, through ignorance rather than wisdom, medieval surgeons sometimes stumbled into the less harmful choice. Of course, they also frequently chose the more harmful option with equal confidence, so it all balanced out into a nightmarish lottery. The wooden box contains the specialized tools. There's a trephine, a more refined version of that skull drill you just witnessed, with a circular cutting edge designed to remove neat rounds of bone. There are curved needles of various sizes for stitching, made from metal or bone. There's a set of bone forceps for pulling out fragments. And then there are the cautery irons, currently heating in a brazier at the corner of the tent, their tips glowing a dull red that'll brighten to orange when they're ready to use. Cautery seals the wound and balances the heat humor. Brother Aldrich explains, apparently deciding you need spiritual and medical education. Fire purifies. The pain drives out evil influences. He says this like it's comforting information. Here's what's actually happening with cauterization. You're burning tissue to create an eschar, a layer of dead, cooked flesh that temporarily seals blood vessels and creates a barrier. It does stop bleeding, which is genuinely useful. It also destroys healthy tissue, creates burns that can become infected, causes excruciating pain, and often needs to be repeated because the eschar falls off. But in an era where your other option for stopping arterial bleeding is pressure and prayer, a red-hot iron starts looking pretty good. Marjorie is sorting through what passes for the pharmacy, a collection of clay pots, leather pouches, and small wooden boxes containing the medical substances of the medieval world. You recognize some from your general knowledge? There's opium, the dried sap from poppy seed pods, which is genuinely effective pain relief. There's yarrow, which does have mild anti-inflammatory properties. There are willow bark extracts containing what will eventually be refined into aspirin. So far, so reasonable. Then there's the weird stuff. A pot labeled in scratchy handwriting contains ground Egyptian mummy, which is literally what it sounds like. Pulverized remains of mummified human corpses, imported at great expense from Egypt and believed to have powerful healing properties. Did it work? Of course not. Did medieval physicians swear by it? Absolutely. There's also powdered unicorn horn, which is actually narwhal tusk, sold to credulous Europeans for astronomical prices. Ground precious stones, fragments of true cross relics, a paste made from earthworms boiled in oil. For the infected wounds, we use this, Marjorie says, holding up a pot of something green and foul-smelling. Moss from a skull, mixed with sage and betterny, draws out the corruption. You're learning that medieval wound care operated on the principle of cures mixed with whatever seems magically powerful must work. Skull moss was believed to be especially potent because it grew on dead men's heads, absorbing their final thoughts or life essence or whatever mystical property you preferred. In reality, certain mosses do have mild antimicrobial properties, so occasionally this actually helped, but not for the reasons anyone thought. The leeches are kept in a ceramic jar filled with water. You can see them through the earthenware, dark, writhing shapes waiting to be applied to patients. Bloodletting was the aspirin of medieval medicine. When in doubt, drain some blood. Fever, bloodletting. Infection, Bloodletting. Broken bone? Believe it or not, bloodletting. The theory was that illness involved too much blood or corrupted blood that needed to be removed, allowing fresh blood to form. The reality was that you were taking already traumatized, blood-depleted patients and making them weaker. Here's something that'll twist your brain. Sometimes bloodletting actually seemed to help. A patient with a raging infection might feel temporary relief after being bled. Why? Probably because the blood loss lowered their blood pressure and reduced inflammation temporarily, creating a short-lived improvement that medieval doctors took as confirmation of their theories. The patient would then die anyway, but nobody connected those dots because, again, they had no idea what was actually happening inside the human body. Thomas picks up what looks like a small crossbow made of metal. For the really deep arrows, he explains, you hook the head, brace against the body, and pull. He demonstrates the motion, and you realize this is a medieval arrow extractor, basically a specialized tool for ripping foreign objects out of flesh with maximum force. Subtle it is not. One of the soldiers brought in while you were examining the instruments provides an immediate demonstration opportunity. He's got a crossbow bolt buried in his thigh, and from the angle it looks like it hit bone and deflected sideways under the muscle. He's been stoic so far, probably in shock, but as Thomas approaches with his extraction tools, the man's eyes go wide. Hold him, Thomas instructs. For people pin the soldier down, his arms, his good leg, and his torso. You're assigned head-holding duty again, which you're starting to realize is the job they give the person they trust least with actual medical decisions. Brother Aldrich offers the man a wooden dowel to bite on. In the movies, people bite leather, but wood is more common here because leather is expensive and nobody wants to waste it on something that'll be destroyed by tooth marks and saliva. Thomas makes an incision next to the entry wound, extending the cut to follow the bolt's path. No anesthetic beyond what's left of the wine they gave the patient an hour ago. The knife goes in, blood wells up, and the soldier's scream is muffled by the dowel clenched between his teeth. You can feel him trying to thrash, every muscle in his body going rigid with agony, but the holders keep him relatively still. Now comes the interesting part. Thomas inserts his fingers directly into the wound, fishing around for the bolt. You can see his hand moving under the skin, distorting the flesh as he traces the projectile's path. This is how you learned anatomy in medieval times, by touch, by experience, by sticking your hands into enough bodies that you developed an intuitive sense of what went where. It's surprisingly effective at building practical knowledge and horrifyingly effective at spreading infection. Got it, Thomas mutters. He attaches the extraction tool to the bolt head. You can see the metal hook disappearing into the wound, and braces his knee against the table. One sharp pull, and the bolt comes free with a wet, sucking sound. Fresh blood pours from the wound, and Thomas immediately starts packing it with cloth soaked in wine. Medieval surgeons had figured out that wine in wounds reduced the chance of infection, though they thought it was because wine was pure and spiritually clean, not because alcohol has antiseptic properties. The cautery iron comes next. One of the camp followers has been keeping it hot, and now she hands it to Thomas with a cloth wrapped around the handle. The tip is glowing orange-red. The soldier sees it coming and starts struggling again despite his weakness, but there's nowhere to go. The iron touches the wound with a hiss, and the smell of burning flesh joins the tense, already overwhelming bouquet. The scream that comes out of the soldier is different from the cutting pain. Deeper, more visceral, the sound of a human being pushed past their limits. Thomas works methodically, touching the iron to multiple points inside the wound to seal the bleeding vessels. Each touch produces that hiss, that smell, that scream. By the fourth application, the soldier has passed out, which everyone treats as a relief. The wound is now a charred, weeping mess that will almost certainly become infected, but it's not actively gushing blood, so by medieval standards, this is a successful procedure. Bandage him and add him to the recovery area, Thomas says. already moving to the next patient. The recovery area, you've learned, is just the corner where treated patients are laid on straw to either heal or die. There's no monitoring, no follow-up care, no checking vitals every few hours. You patch them up, invoke God's mercy, and see who's still alive tomorrow. Here's a quirky detail that historians love to debate. Medieval soldiers sometimes survived truly catastrophic injuries that would kill people in later eras. Why? Possibly because the crude, cauterized, left-to-fade approach occasionally allowed the body's natural healing to take over without the interference of well-meaning but harmful interventions. A soldier left with a cauterized stump and basic bandaging might fare better than a Victorian-era patient subjected to multiple surgeries in bacteria-filled hospitals. It's accidental harm reduction through technological limitation. The next tool demonstration involves the bone saw, and you know this one's coming because there's a man on a table with a leg that's clearly unsalvageable. The limb is crushed below the knee. You can see bone fragments poking through the skin in multiple places, and the foot is pointing in a direction feet shouldn't point. The man is conscious, terrified, and begging in French for someone to save his leg. Thomas examines the injury with practiced eyes. Above the knee, he decides. Can't save anything below. Too much corruption. In modern terms, the man has a comminuted fracture with severe soft tissue damage. You'd need multiple surgeries, pins, external fixators, months of antibiotics. Here, you get an amputation, and if you're lucky, you survive the shock and infection to live as a one-legged beggar. The preparation for amputation is mercifully quick. They give the man a mixture of wine, opium, and some other herbs that might be henbane or hemlock or who knows what. He drinks it desperately, hoping for oblivion. It dulls the pain somewhat but doesn't knock him unconscious. You need much stronger doses for that, and those doses sometimes stop people's breathing permanently, so medieval surgeons were cautious about it. They tie a leather cord above the knee as a tourniquet, twisting it tight with a stick until the blood flow slows. Thomas positions his knife and makes the first circular cut through the skin and muscle, carving around the leg like he's preparing to carve a roast. The screaming starts immediately, the muscle parts under the blade, blood running freely despite the tourniquet. He cuts deeper, working his way around the circumference, exposing the bone. This is when the saw comes out. Thomas positions the blade against the femur and begins sawing with long, forceful strokes. The sound is worse than you imagined. A grinding, rasping noise punctuated by the soldier's screams and the wet sounds of tissue separating. Bone dust and blood spray with each stroke. Takes maybe 2 minutes of continuous sawing, but it feels like hours. The leg comes free. Someone catches it and carries it out of the tent. There's a pit nearby where amputated limbs are disposed of, and by evening, the local dogs and ravens will have found it. The stump is a raw, bleeding mess. Thomas works quickly now, tying off the major blood vessels with silk thread, one of the few genuinely sophisticated techniques medieval surgeons developed. Then comes the cautery iron again, sealing the smaller vessels and the wound surface. The soldier has mercifully passed out. They wrap the stump in bandages soaked with various ointments and carry him to join the others. He has perhaps a 30% chance of surviving the next week. If infection sets in, and it probably will, he'll develop a fever, the wound will become putrid, and he'll either die or require a second amputation higher up, which will likely kill him anyway. You've now witnessed the full range of medieval surgical tools in action. Saws, knives, drills, cautery irons, extraction devices, and the various pharmaceutical substances that pretend to help. Every tool is crude. Every technique is based on flawed theories. Every procedure courts disaster. And yet, and this is what historians still argue about, these tools and techniques represented genuine human ingenuity working within enormous constraints. Medieval surgeons had figured out that speed mattered, that stopping bleeding was crucial, that some herbs genuinely helped. They developed specialized instruments for specific problems. They'd accumulated practical anatomical knowledge through hands-on experience. They just had absolutely no understanding of the invisible world of bacteria that undermined everything they did. Thomas is cleaning his tools now, which means wiping them with a cloth and maybe dunking them in a bucket of water. Tomorrow, these same instruments will be used on new patients, carrying bacteria from today's casualties into tomorrow's wounds. The tools themselves have become weapons, though nobody realizes it. You're learning, Thomas says to you, something that might be approval in his voice. Most people vomit or run. You've stayed. You've stayed, but you're not sure that's a good thing. Your hands smell like blood. Your clothes are soaked with fluids you don't want to identify. The screaming has become background noise. You're adapting to horror, and that realization might be more disturbing than anything you've witnessed so far. The Bloodletter's toolbox is closed now, but it'll open again soon. There are still wounded men waiting. There are still procedures to perform. The tools await, patient and impartial, ready to help and harm in equal measure. The afternoon light is fading through the tent canvas, turning everything a sickly amber color that makes the blood look darker and the faces look more corpse-like. You've been in the medic tent for maybe 6 hours, though it feels like 6 days, and you're starting to understand one of the fundamental truths of medieval battlefield medicine. Most of your job isn't healing people. It's deciding who gets to roll the dice on survival and who doesn't even get that chance. Thomas gestures you over to where a dozen new wounded have just been carried in by stretcher-bearers who look almost as haggard as the casualties themselves. They've been hauling bodies from the battlefield's edges all day, and their clothes are so soaked with other people's blood that they've stopped trying to wipe their hands clean. They simply dump each wounded man on the ground inside the tent and head back out for the next one. No paperwork, no intake forms, no medical history. Just bodies accumulating on the floor like cordwood. Right? Thomas says, cracking his knuckles. Time to sort them. This is triage, though they don't call it that yet. The word won't be coined until the Napoleonic Wars, centuries from now. But the concept is the same. You have limited resources, limited time, and unlimited suffering. Someone has to decide who receives treatment and in what order. In modern emergency medicine, you've got color-coded tags and systematic protocols. Here, you've got Thomas's experienced eye and a set of brutal calculations based on status, survival probability, and available resources. He starts with the nobleman. You can tell the guy's nobility from his armor. Even dented and blood-stained, it's clearly expensive, with engraved details and fitted plates that cost more than a peasant would earn in 10 years. The man himself is unconscious, his face pale, with a deep gash across his chest that's soaked through the padding under his armor. Thomas kneels, peels back the blood-soaked cloth, and examines the wound carefully. Deep but clean, he mutters. Missed the lungs. He'll live if we stitch him and keep the wound clean. He looks at you. He goes first. Brother Aldrich, prepare the thread. You want to protest that there's a man 3 feet away whose leg is fontaining blood, who'll be dead in minutes without attention, but you're learning the hierarchy. Nobles get treated first, not because their lives are medically more salvageable, but because they have families who'll pay for their care, armies who need them back, and political importance that transcends their physical condition. That peasant with the bleeding leg? He'll get to him eventually. Maybe. Here's the dark economic reality of medieval battlefield medicine. Treatment wasn't free. If you survived, you or your family or your lord owed the surgeon payment. Nobles could pay in gold. Knights could offer future service. Common soldiers might pay in whatever they'd looted from the battlefield. The completely destitute might receive charity care from the monks, but resources were finite and priorities were clear. Class determined medical access just like it determined everything else. Brother Aldrich is already threading a curved needle with silk. Yes, actual silk, because for nobility you use the finest materials. For common soldiers, you'll use gut or linen thread. The nobleman is coming around as they position him on the table, groaning and trying to speak. Marjorie holds a cup of wine mixed with opium to his lips, and he drinks greedily. Within minutes, his eyes glaze slightly, still conscious, but the edge is dulled. Thomas works quickly, stitching the chest wound with practiced efficiency. His technique is actually impressive, small, even stitches that pull the wound edges together neatly. Medieval surgeons couldn't afford to be sloppy with noble patients. These people had social power and long memories. Botch a nobleman's treatment, and you might find yourself blamed for his death regardless of the actual medical circumstances. Do good work, and you might earn a permanent position in a castle with steady pay. While Thomas handles the nobleman, Marjorie pulls you toward the line of waiting wounded. "You'll help me with the sorting," she says. It's not a request. She's been doing this for years, following armies from battle to battle, and she's seen more injuries than most physicians. Her hands are steady as she examines the first soldier in line. He's got an arrow in his shoulder, buried deep but not bleeding heavily. "Salvageable," she says. "Mark him for treatment after the nobles are done." She moves to the next. This one's gut shot. You can see the puncture wound in his abdomen, and he's clutching at it weakly. His skin is gray, his breathing shallow and rapid. Marjorie barely pauses. "Dying. Move him to the corner." The corner she indicates is what you're starting to think of as the death zone. A section of the tent where men are laid when they're beyond help but haven't quite finished the process of dying. No treatment, just prayer and waiting. "Wait," you say, your modern sensibilities screaming. "Can't we?" "Do what?" Marjorie cuts you off, not unkindly. "He's bleeding inside. Even if we cut him open, we can't stop it. Even if we could stop it, we can't clean inside the belly without killing him from the shock. He has hours, maybe less. We give him poppy wine and let him go easy." She's right, of course. Abdominal injuries are death sentences here. The peritoneum will become infected, sepsis will set in, and the man will die in agony over the next day or two. The kindest thing you can do is make him comfortable and move on to someone you might actually save. It's brutal calculus, but it's the only calculus that makes sense when you're overwhelmed with casualties and operating with medieval technology. Next patient. Severe burns across his arms and face from some kind of incendiary weapon, probably Greek fire or one of its nastier cousins. The skin is blistered and weeping, already showing signs of infection. Marjorie examines him thoughtfully. Treatable, she decides, but low priority. He's not bleeding out, and the burns won't kill him immediately. Mark him for later. You're starting to understand the categories. Nobles first, then immediately life-threatening injuries to salvageable common soldiers, then serious but non-urgent cases, then the hopeless. It's triage by medieval standards, which means it's influenced by class, by payment potential, by religious considerations, and only somewhat by actual medical need. Here's where it gets even more complicated. Sometimes soldiers lie about their status. A common man-at-arms might claim to be a knight, hoping for better treatment. Camp followers might advocate fiercely for their particular soldier lover or employer. Families show up begging for their sons to be prioritized. You have to make rapid decisions based on incomplete information while people are screaming, bleeding, and dying around you. Thomas finishes with the nobleman and moves to the next highest status patient, a knight whose helmet was partially caved in by a mace. The helmet actually saved his life by distributing the impact, but he's still got a depressed skull fracture and clear signs of brain injury. He's confused, speaking in fragments, and can't seem to move his left side properly. Trepanation, Thomas decides again, will release the pressure. He's already preparing the drill, and you're realizing that skull drilling is just Tuesday afternoon in the medieval medic tent. This is their answer to head trauma. Drill holes, hope the pressure releases, pray the patient survives. While Thomas sets up, Marjorie has you help with the bleeding leg case. The peasant soldier who's been lying there this whole time with a tourniquet someone hastily applied on the battlefield. The leg itself is barely attached, held on by a strip of muscle and skin after a sword stroke nearly severed it completely. The man is barely conscious, shock and blood loss having taken him to a gray twilight state where he's not quite present. "This one's simple," Marjorie says. "Finish the job and cauterize. He won't feel much at this point." She hands you the knife. "You're going to cut through what's left. One clean stroke." Your hands are shaking. This isn't like watching Thomas work. This is you actively causing harm, even if it's necessary harm. The man's leg is ruined, and completing the amputation is the only option. But your modern brain is screaming that you're not qualified, you're not a surgeon, you shouldn't be doing this. "Now," Marjorie says firmly, "while he's still out of it. If you wait, he'll wake up and it'll be worse." You press the blade to the remaining connective tissue. The knife is sharp. Medieval surgeons might have been ignorant about germs, but they understood that sharp blades caused less trauma than dull ones. One stroke, like cutting through tough meat, and the leg separates completely. Blood wells up from the stump, and Marjorie is already there with the cautery iron, pressing it to the wound. The hiss and smell are becoming familiar, which might be the most disturbing realization of all. The patient barely reacts, just a weak moan. You've essentially performed an amputation, your first and hopefully last, and it was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. This is medieval surgery. Brutal, quick, and reliant on the patient being too far gone to fight back. Historians still argue whether medieval triage systems actually improved survival rates or just made resource allocation more efficient without saving more lives. Some evidence suggests that rapid treatment of the salvageable did increase survival rates compared to systems where everyone received equal attention until the caregivers collapsed from exhaustion. Other evidence suggests the survival rates had more to do with individual constitution and luck than anything the medical team did. The debate continues because medieval record-keeping wasn't exactly rigorous about tracking outcomes. The next few hours blur into a repetitive nightmare. You examine injuries, categorize patients, assist with procedures, and watch people die. The gut-shot soldier you marked as hopeless earlier has indeed died, his body already cooling in the corner. He'll be cleared out tonight, added to the mass grave being dug beyond the camp. His family might never know exactly where he fell or how he died. He'll just be missing, one of thousands who disappeared into medieval warfare's hungry maw. A young boy, maybe 14, is brought in with his hand mangled by a sword. He's crying for his mother, terror overriding the pain. Marjorie examines the hand. 3 fingers partially severed, bones visible, the whole mess contaminated with dirt from where he fell. "Can you save the hand?" the boy begs. Marjorie looks at him with something like pity. "Maybe 2 fingers, maybe none. We'll see what we can stitch." She doesn't mention that even if they save the fingers, infection will probably take them anyway, or that the hand will never work properly again, or that he's too young to have much future as a crippled laborer. She just starts cleaning the wound with wine and prepares her needle. You're assigned to comfort duty, holding the boy's other hand, talking to him in a soothing voice while Marjorie does her work. It's utterly inadequate, like putting a bandage on a severed artery, but it's what you can offer. The boy squeezes your hand so hard during the stitching that your fingers go numb. He screams through gritted teeth, trying to be brave, trying to be a man. He's still a child, and this war has destroyed him. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. Medieval surgeons sometimes refused to treat certain injuries, not from cruelty, but from professional self-preservation. If they knew a case was likely to die regardless of treatment, taking it on meant damaging their reputation when the inevitable death occurred. Better to say, "This is beyond my skill," or "God has marked this one for heaven," than to attempt treatment and be blamed for the failure. Marjorie, as a woman without formal status, doesn't have that luxury. She treats everyone she's told to treat, and nobody blames her when they die because nobody expected a woman to save them anyway. The tent is filling up faster than you can process patients. More wounded keep arriving as stretcher bearers expand their search radius from the battlefield. Some of these injuries are days-old men who crawled into hiding or were trapped under dead horses, slowly dying of thirst and infected wounds. They're barely alive when they arrive, and most of them won't survive the night even with treatment. Thomas makes another brutal decision. No more taking the hopeless cases. If they're gonna die anyway, leave them out there. We only have room for the ones we might save. Sounds cruel, but it's pragmatic. The tent has limited space, and every dying man taking up room is space that a salvageable patient can't use. Brother Aldrich objects on theological grounds. Every soul deserves a chance for final confession, for shriving before death. Thomas just stares at him until the monk backs down. In the battlefield medic tent, practical medicine trumps religious comfort, though barely. You're standing in the middle of organized chaos, covered in blood and other fluids, making life and death decisions about people whose names you don't know. The candlelight is flickering. Night is coming, and work will continue in the darkness with even worse visibility and greater exhaustion. Your back aches, your hands are raw, and you've stopped smelling the overwhelming stench because your olfactory system has simply given up. This is Triage by Candlelight in 1346, a brutal sorting of human beings into categories of worthiness, survivability, and resource allocation. No computers, no protocols, no systematic approach beyond save who you can and don't waste time on the rest. It's medieval efficiency meeting medieval horror, and you're standing right in the middle of it, complicit in every decision, unable to change the fundamental mathematics of insufficient care for overwhelming need. Another wave of wounded is arriving. Marjorie catches your eye and nods toward them. Time to sort again. Time to choose who lives and who dies, though you're increasingly aware that your choices matter less than you'd like to think. Most of these men's fates were sealed the moment the weapon struck. You're just deciding whether they die quickly in the corner or slowly on the treatment table. Welcome to the moral mathematics of medieval medicine, where every calculation comes up short and every answer is wrong. The man on the table is screaming before Thomas even touches him. He knows what's coming. He's been watching the amputations all day while waiting his turn, and now his crushed arm is the subject of discussion. The injury came from being trampled by a warhorse, and you can see where the hoof came down. The forearm is pulverized from elbow to wrist, the bones shattered into fragments, the flesh swollen to twice its normal size and already showing the purple-black discoloration of tissue death. Above the elbow, Thomas announces, running his finger along the man's upper arm to mark the cutting point. Can't save anything below. Corruption's already setting in. He's right. You can smell it, that sweet rotten odor that means gangrene is beginning its work. In your time, this might be salvageable with immediate surgery, antibiotics, multiple procedures. Here, it's simple. Cut off the dying part before it kills the whole person. The patient is an archer, maybe 30 years old, and he understands what losing his arm means. I can't pull a bow with one arm, he says, his voice cracking. I can't work. I can't. He's spiraling into the realization that his entire livelihood just ended. Archery was his skill, his profession, his identity. Now he'll be a one-armed beggar if he survives at all. You'll live, Thomas says bluntly. Maybe. That's more than most get. It's not comforting, but it's honest. He turns to organize his instruments while Marjorie prepares the ligatures, silk threads for tying off blood vessels. You're learning that amputations follow a rhythm, almost like a dark assembly line. Patient arrives. Assessment made. Cutting level determined. Restraints applied. Cut. Saw. Cauterize. Next. Here's something that'll haunt you, Medieval surgeons got fast at amputations because they did so many of them. Thomas can take a leg off in under 5 minutes, start to finish. Speed developed through volume created by warfare's endless supply of mangled limbs. He's not fast because he's talented, though he's fast because he's done this hundreds of times. Every battlefield creates a fresh training ground for amputation technique. They position the archer on the table and 4 men hold him down, 1 on each limb. You're on head duty again, which means you get to watch his face during the procedure. They give him wine laced with opium, but the supply is running low, so the dose is smaller than usual. He'll feel most of this. Brother Aldrich offers prayers that sound increasingly rote, like he's said them so many times today that the words have lost meaning. Thomas wraps the tourniquet around the upper arm, twisting it tight until the blood flow slows to a trickle. He picks up his largest knife and begins the circular cut through the skin and muscle. The archer's scream is immediate and piercing, a sound that seems to resonate in your chest. His whole body convulses against the restraints, every muscle straining against the men holding him. The knife goes deeper, cutting through muscle layers in a spiral pattern that exposes the bone. Blood runs freely despite the tourniquet. You can never stop all the bleeding, just reduce it. Thomas works with mechanical efficiency, his hands steady, his face showing neither pleasure nor disgust, just concentration. He's performed this exact procedure so many times it's become routine, like a carpenter cutting wood or a blacksmith shaping metal. When the muscle is cleared, the bone saw comes out. The archer sees it and starts begging. Please, please, just let me die, please. But Thomas ignores him. Mercy here means finishing quickly, not stopping. The saw touches bone and begins its work, that horrible grinding rasp filling the tent. Bone dust mixes with blood, creating a pink spray. The archer's voice breaks from screaming, becoming a raw animal sound. Takes maybe 90 seconds of sawing, though it feels eternal. The bone parts, the arm comes free, and someone carries it away to the disposal pit. The archer has either passed out or gone into some kind of dissociative state. His eyes are open but not seeing, his mouth slack. Shock, probably, his body's mercy mechanism shutting down non-essential functions to cope with overwhelming trauma. Thomas ties off the blood vessels with practiced speed, his fingers working quickly to isolate and ligature each major artery and vein. This is actually sophisticated technique. Many surgeons in later centuries didn't bother with ligatures, just cauterized everything, which resulted in more deaths from hemorrhage. Medieval military surgeons learned through brutal trial and error that tying off vessels improved survival rates, even if they didn't understand the circulatory system's mechanics. The cautery iron comes next, sealing the smaller vessels and the wound surface. The smell of burning flesh barely registers anymore. You've become desensitized, another small horror to add to the collection. They wrap the stump in bandages soaked with some kind of herbal mixture, then carry the archer to the recovery area. He's got maybe a 50-50 chance of surviving the next week. If infection sets in, he'll need a second amputation higher up, which will almost certainly kill him. Next, Thomas says, already moving. There's no pause for reflection, no moment of acknowledgement that a man's life just permanently changed. There are too many waiting, too many limbs to remove, too much work to do. The assembly line continues. The next patient is already positioned, a knight with a leg crushed below the knee by a falling horse. At least this one is unconscious, already deep in shock from blood loss and trauma. Thomas examines the injury and makes his decision in seconds. Below knee, clean cut. The procedure begins again. You're learning the variations in amputation technique. Limbs are cut at different levels depending on injury location, patient status, and Thomas's assessment of what can be saved. Below knee amputations are preferable to above knee because they're less traumatic and allow for better mobility with crutches later. But if the damage extends too high or if infection is suspected, you cut higher to be safe. Better to take too much healthy tissue than leave any corrupted flesh that might poison the whole body. Historians still argue about medieval amputation survival rates. Some estimates put survival at around 30 to 40%, which is shockingly high given the complete lack of sterile technique. Other estimates are far lower. The truth probably varied enormously based on surgeon skill, patient constitution, time of year. Infections were worse in summer heat, and pure luck. What's clear is that plenty of people did survive amputations and lived for years afterward, which speaks to both human resilience and the body's remarkable ability to heal despite terrible interference. The knight's amputation is textbook, if there were textbooks for this, which there really aren't. Medical knowledge is passed down through apprenticeship and experience, not standardized education. Thomas learned from another surgeon who learned from another surgeon, all the way back through an unbroken chain of blood-soaked mentorship. Each generation adds little refinements, little tricks, but the fundamental technique, cut, saw, seal, pray, remains unchanged. By the time Thomas finishes with the knight, 3 more amputation cases have arrived. A hand mangled by a mace, a foot nearly severed by a sword, an arm broken so badly that the bone fragments have shredded the muscle beyond repair. Each one joins the queue, and each one will leave the tent with less body than they arrived with. Marjorie pulls you aside while Thomas works. "See that man?" She points to a soldier with a relatively minor leg wound. "He's going to die." You look at her confused. The wound doesn't look terrible, certainly not compared to some of the horrors you've seen today. "Blood poisoning," she explains. "See the red streaks going up his leg? That's corruption spreading to his heart. By tomorrow he'll be fevered. Day after, dead." She's describing septicemia, bacterial infection spreading through the bloodstream. The red streaks are inflamed lymphatic vessels carrying bacteria toward the heart and brain. In your time, massive antibiotics might save him. Here, there's nothing to do but watch him die. Amputation won't help at this point because the infection is already systemic. Why not amputate? You ask. At least try. Because he'll die anyway, and the amputation will just make his last days more painful. Better to let him go whole. It's brutal pragmatism again, the same calculation that governs every decision in this tent. Limited resources, unlimited suffering, impossible choices. Here's a quirky detail about medieval amputations. Surgeons sometimes kept the severed limbs for study, examining the internal structure, learning anatomy through direct observation. This was technically forbidden by the church in many periods. Dissecting human remains was theologically problematic, but battlefield surgeons had ready access to body parts and few people questioned what happened to them. It was gross practical education, turning warfare's waste into medical knowledge. Thomas is now on his 6th amputation of the day. This one's a young soldier with a gangrened foot. He waited too long to seek treatment, probably trying to tough it out, and now the infection has spread to midcalf. The foot is black, swollen, leaking fluid that smells like death concentrated. Everyone near him can smell it, that unmistakable odor of rotting flesh. "This is what waiting gets you," Thomas says, apparently deciding to use this as a teaching moment. "If he'd come when the wound was fresh, we might have saved the foot. Now we take the leg below the knee and hope we got all the rot." It's a warning to the other wounded watching. Don't be brave. Don't wait. Come immediately because delay means more tissue lost. The procedure follows the familiar pattern, but this time there's extra cauterization to make sure any lingering infection is burned away. The theory is that fire purifies, which is partially true. Heat does kill bacteria, but the extensive burning also damages healthy tissue and creates more opportunity for new infection. It's a trade-off made in ignorance of what's actually happening at the microscopic level. By evening, The pile of severed limbs outside the tent has grown considerable. Arms, legs, hands, feet. A grotesque collection that looks like spare parts for building humans. The local dogs are circling, waiting for nightfall when they can scavenge. Nature's disposal system, turning battlefield waste into fuel for scavengers. The Circle of Life, Medieval Edition. You're helping with bandage changes now, checking the earlier amputations to see how they're doing. Some look relatively good, the stumps are oozing clear fluid, the patients are alert, complaining of pain, which is actually a good sign because it means they're not deep in shock. Others look terrible, the stumps are hot, swollen, leaking pus, and the patients are fevered and delirious. Those ones probably won't make it. One man grabs your arm as you pass. "My leg," he whispers. "Where's my leg? I can still feel it." He's experiencing phantom limb pain, that bizarre phenomenon where the brain continues to receive signals from nerves that no longer connect to anything. To him, his missing leg is still there, still hurting, and no amount of showing him the stump makes the sensation go away. In your time, you understand this is neurological, the brain's wiring still sending signals through pathways that haven't caught up to the new reality. Here, they think it's the spirit of the limb lingering, or humors in distress, or divine punishment. The pain will fade. Marjorie tells him gently, which is partially true. Phantom sensations do sometimes diminish with time, though many amputees experience them for life. But telling a man who just lost his leg that he'll hurt forever isn't helpful, so she offers comfort instead of accuracy. Thomas is finally taking a break, drinking wine and eating bread that's hard enough to require serious chewing. His hands are crusted with dried blood, and he hasn't bothered washing them. Why would he, when they'll just get bloody again in a few minutes? He sees you watching and raises his cup in a sardonic toast. "Welcome to the trade," he says. "Still want to be a surgeon?" The honest answer is no. You want to be anywhere but here, doing anything but this. But you're trapped in this medieval nightmare, and the amputations will continue whether you want them to or not. More casualties are already arriving, and you can see from here that at least 2 of them have injuries that'll require cutting. Here's what the history books won't tell you about medieval battlefield amputations. They're not heroic. They're not dramatic last-minute saves. They're brutal, repetitive, assembly line butchery performed by exhausted men on terrified patients with crude tools and no real understanding of what they're doing. Sometimes people survive. Often they don't. And when they do survive, their lives are permanently diminished in a society that has no social safety net for the disabled. The assembly line continues into the night. Cut, saw, cauterize. Next. Each amputation identical to the last. Each patient's screams blending into a chorus of agony. You've become part of the machine now, holding limbs, preparing instruments, offering meaningless comfort to men who are losing pieces of themselves. And tomorrow, when the next battle happens or when you move to the next battlefield's aftermath, it'll start again. Different men, same procedures, same odds, same grinding horror of medieval military medicine reducing human beings to meat that needs trimming. The saw is already cutting into another bone. The screaming has started again. Your shift isn't over. It'll never be over, not really, because even when you leave this tent, you'll carry it with you forever. 3 days have passed since you arrived at the medic tent, and the smell has become a living thing. It's not just unpleasant anymore. It's a physical presence that coats your throat, seeps into your clothes, and follows you even when you step outside for air. The primary culprit is the infected wounds, which produce an odor that's somehow both sweet and putrid, like fruit rotting mixed with sewage. Add to that the smell of cauterized flesh, which lingers like burnt pork, the metallic tang of fresh blood, the sour stench of vomit and excrement from men whose bowels have given up, and the general funk of unwashed bodies packed into close quarters. and you've got an olfactory nightmare that makes breathing feel like an act of violence against your own senses. But the smell is just the warning sign. The real horror is what's causing it. The infections that are blooming across nearly every wound in the tent, turning routine injuries into death sentences and survivable amputations into slow executions. You're making rounds with Marjorie, checking on the patients from the first day's treatment. The nobleman whose chest wound Thomas stitched so carefully? He's fevered now, thrashing on his pallet, muttering incoherently. Marjorie peels back his bandage, and you immediately see the problem. The wound edges are red and swollen, with yellow pus oozing from between the stitches. The infection has set in despite the silk thread, despite the wine washing, despite everyone's best efforts. "We'll drain it and repack it," Marjorie says matter-of-factly. She takes a small knife and opens one end of the wound, releasing a flood of pus that smells like death concentrated into liquid form. The nobleman screams as she presses on the surrounding tissue, squeezing out more infection. Then she packs the open wound with cloth soaked in honey and herbs, a treatment that actually has some antimicrobial properties, though nobody here knows why it works. "Will he live?" you ask. Marjorie shrugs. "Maybe. Nobles have strong constitutions. Or maybe God favors them. Or maybe he'll be dead tomorrow. We'll see. It's the same answer for everything. Maybe, possibly, we'll see. Medieval medicine is gambling with lives, and the house always has better odds. The archer who lost his arm above the elbow is worse off. His stump has turned a disturbing shade of greenish-black, and the smell emanating from it makes you gag even after 3 days of desensitization. This is gangrene, tissue death spreading from the amputation site. The flesh is literally rotting while still attached to his living body, and the infection is spreading upward toward his shoulder. Thomas examines the stump with a grim expression. "Reamputation," he announces. "Higher up. It's the only chance." The archer is barely conscious, his skin gray and slick with fever sweat. He doesn't protest when they carry him to the table because he's too far gone to understand what's happening. This will be his second amputation in 3 days, and the odds of surviving it are minimal. They cut higher, taking the arm nearly to the shoulder joint, chasing the infection up the limb. It's a desperate measure. The more tissue you remove, the greater the shock to the system, the more blood loss, the higher the chance that the procedure itself kills the patient. But leaving the gangrenous tissue guarantees death, so you take the chance. The archer dies on the table halfway through the procedure, his body simply giving up after too much trauma, too much blood loss, too much systemic infection. They carry his corpse out and move on to the next patient. Here's a mainstream historical fact that'll make you understand why infection was so devastating. In medieval warfare, disease and infection killed far more soldiers than combat wounds. For every man who died from a sword thrust or arrow strike, 3 or 4 died from the infections that followed, or from camp diseases like dysentery and typhus. The battlefield was just the opening act. The real killing happened in the days and weeks afterward in places like this tent. You're learning to recognize the stages of wound infection. First comes the redness and heat, inflammation as the body tries to fight off the bacterial invasion. Then the swelling as fluid accumulates. Then the pus formation, yellow or green depending on the bacteria involved. If treatment at this stage works, draining, cleaning, repacking, the patient might recover. But if the infection spreads deeper, you get the red streaks of septicemia spreading up limbs, or the blackening of gangrene as tissue dies, or the bone-deep infections called osteomyelitis that are essentially incurable with medieval technology. Brother Aldrich has a different interpretation. Sin enters through the wound. He explains while praying over a fevered soldier. The corruption of the body reflects spiritual corruption. Prayer and confession drive out the evil, allowing God's healing grace to enter. He honestly believes this, and when patients occasionally recover after his prayers, It reinforces his conviction that divine intervention works better than earthly medicine. Here's the quirky historical detail. Medieval physicians sometimes agreed with him, They believed that a patient's spiritual state could influence healing, that sins or moral failings could make wounds corrupt and resist treatment. It's completely wrong from a medical standpoint, but it reflects a holistic view of human health that didn't separate physical and spiritual well-being. The problem is that when this view leads to blaming dying patients for lacking sufficient faith or harboring secret sins, it adds psychological torture to their physical suffering. Marjorie takes you to see one of the more disturbing infection cases. A soldier with a relatively minor leg wound that somehow has spawned maggots. You can see them writhing in the wound, white larvae feeding on dead tissue. Your modern instinct is revulsion, but Marjorie is nodding approvingly. The worms eat only the rotten flesh, she says. They clean the wound better than we can. This one might live. She's accidentally discovered maggot debridement therapy, which is actually legitimate medicine that would be rediscovered and validated centuries later. Certain fly larvae do indeed only eat necrotic tissue, leaving healthy flesh alone, and they secrete substances that have antibacterial properties. But Marjorie doesn't know she's doing something medically sound. She just knows from experience that wounds with maggots sometimes heal better than wounds without them, even though maggots are generally considered a bad sign. The maggots came from flies, of course, which are everywhere in the tent. They buzz around constantly, landing on wounds, on food, on faces, spreading bacteria from the dying to the living. Marjorie waves them away periodically, but it's pointless. There are too many, and they keep coming back, drawn by the smell of blood and rot. The tent is essentially a giant fly breeding ground, each insect a tiny vector carrying infection from patient to patient. You're helping change bandages now, a task that's become routine and horrible in equal measure. Each bandage you remove reveals a new horror. A wound that looked good yesterday is now oozing pus. A stump that seemed to be healing has developed a concerning odor. A chest wound has opened along one edge, exposing muscle beneath. You clean what you can with wine or vinegar, apply whatever poultice Marjorie indicates, and wrap it with cloth that was probably dirty to begin with. The young boy with the mangled hand from a few days ago is fevered now. Marjorie examines his hand and makes a quick decision. The fingers need to come off. The rot is spreading. She doesn't bother with the elaborate preparation used for major amputations. She just ties off each infected finger at the base and cuts them off with a quick knife stroke. The boy is too fevered to scream much, just whimpering as his remaining fingers are removed. 3 stumps remain where 5 fingers used to be, and even those might not survive the infection. Here's what historians still argue about. Did medieval surgeons understand that some wounds were more prone to infection than others? Evidence suggests they did notice patterns. They knew that gut wounds almost always led to fatal corruption, that wounds contaminated with dirt healed worse than clean cuts, that summer wounds festered more than winter ones. But without germ theory, they attributed these patterns to humoral imbalances, planetary influences, or divine will rather than understanding the actual mechanism of bacterial infection. Thomas is dealing with a particularly nasty case. A knight whose thigh wound has developed what they call hospital gangrene. Though nobody uses that term yet, the wound is spreading rapidly, the tissue turning black and sloughing off in chunks, producing that sweet rotten smell intensified to nightmare levels. This is necrotizing fasciitis, flesh-eating bacteria literally dissolving tissue faster than the body can heal. In your time, this requires emergency surgery, massive antibiotics, and aggressive debridement, and even then survival is uncertain. Here, Thomas just keeps cutting away dead tissue, chasing the infection as it spreads. "We'll amputate if it reaches the hip joint," he says calmly, as if discussing the weather. The knight is barely conscious, his body consumed by fever, His chances of surviving either the infection or the proposed amputation essentially zero. But they'll try anyway because that's what they do here. They try everything no matter how hopeless, because occasionally someone defies the odds and survives. The infection ward, really just a designated section of the tent, is filling with the doomed. Men whose wounds looked survivable a few days ago are now clearly dying of sepsis. Their fevers spike. Their wounds leak foul-smelling discharge. Their eyes glaze with delirium. Some rave, seeing visions of demons or angels. Others become eerily calm, accepting their approaching death with medieval fatalism. Brother Aldrich moves among them, offering last rites, hearing final confessions, providing what comfort faith can offer when medicine has failed. You watch a man die from what started as a simple arm wound. The infection spread to his armpit lymph nodes, then systemically through his blood. By the end, he's burning with fever, his whole body trembling, his breathing rapid and shallow. Then he just stops. No dramatic final words, no peaceful closing of eyes, just a cessation of movement as his body gives up. Another corpse for the cart. Here's the terrible math. Maybe 1 in 3 wound patients develops serious infection. Of those, maybe 1 in 3 survives. So for every 9 wounded men brought to the tent, roughly 2 die from infection alone, not counting those who die from the initial injury or from surgical complications. The tent isn't saving most of these people. It's just providing a more comfortable place to die than the battlefield. Marjorie shows you a wound treatment that seems particularly medieval in its logic. She's applying a poultice made from bread mold mixed with honey and herbs. The mold draws out corruption, she explains. The crazy thing is, she might be accidentally right. Certain bread molds produce penicillin, the antibiotic that won't be discovered for another 600 years. But the concentrations are too low, the application too inconsistent, and the other infections too overwhelming for it to make much difference. The soldier with the blood poisoning that Marjorie predicted would die. He's dying. The red streaks have spread up his leg, across his torso, and he's delirious with fever. His wound is minor, just a cut on his calf, but the bacteria entered his bloodstream and now they're everywhere, multiplying in his blood, his organs, his brain. He'll be dead by morning, killed by organisms too small to see, against which medieval medicine is completely powerless. Thomas is arguing with Brother Aldrich about a treatment. The monk wants to apply a poultice containing ground-up relics, supposedly fragments of a saint's bone that have miraculous healing properties. Thomas thinks it's nonsense and wants to stick with wine and cautery. They compromise by doing both, which satisfies everyone's beliefs while probably accomplishing nothing useful. The patient dies anyway, and both can claim they did their best. You're starting to understand a horrible truth. Most of what happens in this tent makes no medical difference. The patients who survive would probably survive with minimal care. The patients who die would die regardless of treatment. All the cutting, burning, poulticing, and praying is mostly just activity that makes people feel like they're doing something useful, while the real battle between bacteria and immune system plays out invisibly at the cellular level. But occasionally, intervention does matter. A bleeding artery gets clamped and tied, saving a life that would otherwise drain away. An infected wound gets drained before sepsis spreads systemically. An amputation removes gangrenous tissue before it poisons the whole body. These genuine saves are rare enough to be notable but frequent enough to justify the whole enterprise. You keep working because sometimes, occasionally, someone lives who wouldn't have otherwise. The smell intensifies as night falls. The fevered patients are sweating. The infections are spreading. The wounds are weeping. Fresh cases arrive. New wounded from skirmishes or from outlying areas where men have been slowly dying for days. Each one brings new variations on familiar themes. Cuts, breaks, burns, infections. The assembly line of suffering continues, relentless and grinding. Marjorie is teaching you to recognize the smell of different infections. That sweet smell is rot, gangrene, or deep abscesses. That sour smell is pus from surface infections. That smell like rotten eggs is gas gangrene. That one kills fast. She's right. You're developing an unfortunate expertise in the olfactory spectrum of human decomposition and bacterial growth. A man is begging for death. His abdominal wound has become infected, and he's dying slowly of peritonitis, inflammation, and infection of the abdominal lining. It's excruciating, and there's nothing to be done except give him progressively larger doses of opium and hope he slips away peacefully. But the opium supplies are running low, so he gets less than he needs, and his death will take days instead of hours. Medieval mercy has sharp limits. The worms, the rot, the unstoppable spread of infection through wound after wound after wound. This is the reality of battlefield medicine before antibiotics, before antisepsis, before anyone understood that invisible organisms were eating people alive from the inside out. You're not fighting disease here. You're just watching it win over and over again with occasional Pyrrhic victories that barely dent the overall mortality rate. And tomorrow you'll do it all again, because the wounded keep coming and the infections keep spreading and there's no other choice. Welcome to the losing war against medieval infection, where the enemy is invisible, the weapons don't work, and the casualties just keep mounting. The fever ward is where hope goes to die. You've started thinking of it that way because the men who end up in this section of the tent rarely leave except in the corpse cart. It's not even a separate physical space, just an area where they've clustered the patients whose wounds are healing but whose bodies are betraying them anyway, consumed by fevers that have nothing to do with their injuries and everything to do with the medieval army camp's appalling sanitation. You're walking through with Brother Aldrich, who's carrying a bucket of water that's supposedly been blessed, though you're pretty sure it came from the same contaminated stream as everything else. A soldier reaches out weakly as you pass, his hand trembling. His face is flushed with fever, but when you touch his forehead, his skin feels cold and clammy. He's shivering despite the warmth of the tent, wrapped in every scrap of cloth they could spare. The ague, Brother Aldrich says matter-of-factly, comes from the bad air rising from the marshes. He's describing malaria, though that name won't be used for centuries. The theory he's referencing, that disease comes from miasma or bad air, is completely wrong, but it's the prevailing medical wisdom of the age. Nobody's figured out that mosquitoes are the culprit, those tiny insects buzzing around the tent right now, spreading parasites with every bite. The soldiers' teeth are chattering so hard you can hear them clicking together. This is the classic malarial cycle. First the chills, so intense that men have been known to crack their own teeth from the violent shivering. Then comes the burning fever, where their skin becomes hot enough to feel like they're being cooked from the inside. Then the sweating phase, where they soak through their clothes and bedding. Then a period of relative normalcy before the cycle starts again. Some men survive malaria, many don't, and those who do survive often suffer recurring attacks for years afterward. Here's a mainstream fact that explains why medieval armies were such disease factories. Camps were typically established near water sources, which meant near the swamps and standing water where mosquitoes bred. Add in thousands of men living in close quarters, poor sanitation, contaminated water supplies, and general filth, and you've got perfect conditions for disease to spread through the population like wildfire. Dysentery, typhus, typhoid, malaria, and dozens of other diseases killed more soldiers than all the swords and arrows combined. Thomas is examining a patient with different symptoms. Explosive diarrhea that's literally killing him through dehydration. The man has lost so much fluid that his eyes are sunken. His skin is tenting when you pinch it, and he's barely conscious. This is dysentery, probably caused by contaminated water or food, though the bacterial culprits, Shigella or various E. coli strains, won't be identified for centuries. We keep giving him water, but he just voids it out, Thomas says, frustrated. The bowels won't hold anything. He's identified the problem but has no solution. In your time, you'd give 4 fluids, electrolyte replacement, antibiotics. Here, they can offer water by mouth and hope the patient absorbs enough to survive. Most don't. The man on the pallet has maybe a day left before his organs shut down from dehydration. Marjorie is dealing with a soldier who's covered in a distinctive rash. Tiny red spots spreading across his torso and limbs. Camp fever, she says, which is what they call typhus. It's caused by bacteria spread by body lice, and in the close, unwashed conditions of an army camp, lice spread from person to person like a plague. The bacteria they carry causes high fever, headache, confusion, and that characteristic rash. The mortality rate is roughly 20 to 30%, and there's absolutely nothing medieval medicine can do except keep the patient comfortable and wait to see if their immune system wins the fight. Why don't we separate the fevered ones from the wounded ones? You ask, your modern understanding of quarantine and infection control screaming at the stupidity of keeping disease victims in close proximity to surgery patients. Thomas looks at you like you've said something obvious but pointless. And put them where? We've barely got room as it is. Besides, the fevers come from bad air and humoral imbalance, not from person to person. Separating them won't help. He's wrong, of course. Many of these diseases are highly contagious, but without germ theory, the concept of quarantine makes no logical sense. Why separate people if disease comes from air or astrological influences or God's will? Here's a quirky detail that shows how close medieval medicine came to understanding contagion without actually getting there. They noticed that some diseases seem to spread through communities, moving from person to person. They called these pestilential diseases and sometimes implemented crude quarantine measures. But their theoretical framework was so flawed that they couldn't consistently apply the insight. Disease spread because of shared bad air, or divine punishment of a community, or astrological conjunctions affecting everyone simultaneously, not because something passed from the sick to the healthy. A young soldier, he can't be more than 16, is in the grip of what they're calling the sweating sickness. He's burning with fever, drenched in sweat that soaks through his bedding and drips onto the floor, and he's terrified because he's watching others die from the same symptoms. The sweating sickness was a mysterious disease that plagued medieval Europe for centuries, killing people within hours of symptoms appearing. Modern historians still argue about what it actually was. Some form of hantavirus? A particularly virulent influenza? Some disease that no longer exists? Nobody knows for sure. The boy grabs your hand. Am I going to die? His eyes are pleading, desperate for reassurance you can't honestly give. You're young and strong, you say, which is true but irrelevant to whether a virus or bacteria will kill him. Rest and let the physicians work. It's a non-answer, but what else can you offer? The truth is too cruel. His survival is random chance, dependent on factors nobody in this tent understands or can control. Brother Aldrich anoints him with oil and offers prayers. The spiritual care is all they can really provide. The boy doesn't want prayers. He wants his mother, wants to go home, wants to not die in this stinking tent surrounded by strangers. But he's trapped here, just like everyone else, waiting to see if his body can fight off an infection that medieval medicine doesn't even recognize as an infection. You're learning to recognize the different camp diseases by their presentations. There's the flux, dysentery, with its bloody diarrhea and gut-wrenching cramps. There's the spotted fever, typhus, with its rash and delirium. There's the quartan ague, malaria, with its predictable fever cycles. There's the mysterious sweating sickness that kills fast and terrifyingly. And then there are the respiratory diseases, the ones that fill lungs with fluid and slowly suffocate people. A soldier in the corner is coughing up blood-tinged sputum, his breathing labored and wheezy. Pneumonia, probably, or tuberculosis or some other lung infection. Each cough sprays droplets into the air, spreading bacteria to everyone nearby, but nobody realizes this is happening. Thomas attributes the cough to phlegmatic humors accumulating in the lungs and prescribes bloodletting to rebalance the patient. This will make him weaker and less able to fight the infection, but it's standard treatment based on flawed theory, so everyone thinks they're helping. Marjorie shows you another case. A man whose gums are bleeding, whose teeth are loose, and whose old wounds are reopening. Scurvy, she identifies correctly. This is vitamin C deficiency, common in armies that lack fresh fruits and vegetables. The treatment is actually simple. Give him citrus or fresh greens, but the army's supply chain doesn't reliably provide these, so soldiers suffer and die from a completely preventable disease. We give him sour ale and pickled cabbage when we can get it, Marjorie explains. The pickled cabbage actually does contain some vitamin C, so this treatment sometimes works, but nobody knows why. They just know that certain foods help certain symptoms, and that knowledge is passed down without understanding the mechanism. Here's what makes the fever ward particularly nightmarish. Many of these diseases are contagious, spreading through the tent via droplets, lice, mosquitoes, contaminated water, and unwashed hands. But nobody washes their hands because nobody knows that hands can carry disease. Thomas goes from examining a typhus patient to treating a wound patient without washing, spreading bacteria from one to the other. Marjorie uses the same water bucket for multiple patients, spreading dysentery-causing bacteria with every ladle. You yourself are probably a vector, carrying infections on your clothes and skin from patient to patient. The mortality rate in the fever ward is staggering. You've been keeping an informal count, and roughly half the men who develop serious fever die within a week. Some die in days. A few die in hours, like the sweating sickness victims who seem fine in the morning and are corpses by evening. The corpse cart comes twice a day now to handle the volume, and the mass grave beyond the camp is filling rapidly. A man is hallucinating, screaming about demons coming for his soul. This is typhus affecting his brain, causing delirium and paranoia. Brother Aldrich tries to calm him with prayers, but the man is beyond reaching. He sees horrors that aren't there, reliving battles or encountering supernatural visions created by his fevered brain. Eventually, he exhausts himself and falls into a stupor. He'll either wake up on the road to recovery or slip into a coma and die. There's no way to predict which. The treatment options for fever are limited and mostly useless. Bloodletting to cool the hot humors. Herbal poultices applied to the forehead or chest. Prayers and holy relics, keeping the patient warm or cool depending on which phase of fever they're experiencing. None of it addresses the actual cause, bacterial or viral infection, because nobody knows that's the cause. They're treating symptoms with methods that occasionally provide comfort but rarely change outcomes. You watch Thomas attempt to treat a patient with what he calls brain fever, probably meningitis or encephalitis, infection and inflammation of the brain or its protective membranes. The man is rigid, his neck stiff, his back arched, his consciousness fading. Thomas's treatment involves bloodletting from the temples and applying leeches to the neck to draw out the excess heat. This does absolutely nothing to help and probably hastens the patient's death by weakening him further. He's in God's hands now, Brother Aldrich intones, which is medieval code for, we've done everything we can think of and it didn't work. The patient dies that night, his brain consumed by inflammation that medieval medicine couldn't identify, treat, or prevent. Here's what historians still argue about regarding medieval camp diseases. Did armies develop any immunity over time? There's evidence that veteran soldiers survived diseases at higher rates than new recruits, possibly because they'd been exposed to various pathogens and developed immunity. But there's also evidence that armies were constantly decimated by disease regardless of experience level, suggesting that immunity provided limited protection against the full range of medieval diseases. The debate continues because medieval sources rarely distinguished between different types of fever, making it hard to track specific diseases historically. A commotion near the tent entrance. More fever cases arriving from a different section of the camp. These are men from the supply wagons, camp followers and servants who've been hit by what looks like typhoid, a different but equally deadly bacterial infection spread through contaminated food and water. They're fevered, confused, some with characteristic rose spots on their abdomens. The disease will spread through their intestinal tracts, potentially perforating their bowels and killing them through internal bleeding and sepsis. The tent is now housing wounded soldiers, amputation cases, infected wounds, and at least 4 different contagious diseases, all in close proximity with zero infection control. It's a petri dish of medieval pathology. Every patient a potential vector, every surface contaminated, the air itself thick with disease-causing organisms that nobody can see or understand. Marjorie is trying to keep track of who has what symptoms, which is challenging when multiple diseases present with similar fever patterns. Is that man's fever from his infected wound, or has he contracted typhus from the patient next to him? Is that soldier's delirium from blood loss or from brain fever? The diagnostic confusion is total, and treatment is essentially guess and hope. A man is vomiting black bile, actually digested blood from a bleeding ulcer or intestinal hemorrhage. The physicians interpret this as an excess of black bile humor and discuss whether to induce more vomiting or to use purgatives to expel it through the other end. Both options will make him worse, but nobody realizes this. He dies the next morning, and everyone agrees the black bile corruption was too advanced to treat. The young soldier with the sweating sickness has stopped sweating. For a moment, you think this means he's recovering, but Marjorie shakes her head grimly. When the sweating stops suddenly like that, they usually die within the hour. She's right. His body has given up the fight, shutting down rather than continuing to battle. He dies quietly, almost peacefully, one more teenage casualty of medieval warfare and medieval disease. You're surrounded by dying men, killed by organisms too small to see, against which all the knowledge and skill in this tent is useless. The fever ward is where the limits of medieval medicine become undeniable, where humoral theory and bloodletting and prayer demonstrate their complete inadequacy against the reality of infectious disease. And tomorrow, more fever cases will arrive, and the cycle will continue, and nothing you do will make any meaningful difference. Welcome to the invisible war, where the enemy is everywhere and the weapons don't work. The dawn breaks gray and cold, and Thomas is shaking you awake from where you collapsed on a pile of straw sometime after midnight. Battlefield retrieval, he says. They need extra hands. Your body aches from days of standing, your clothes are stiff with dried blood, and the last thing you want is to leave the relative safety of the tent. But you're learning that in medieval battlefield medicine, there's no such thing as optional duty. You're handed a leather satchel containing basic supplies: cloth for bandaging, a flask of wine for cleaning wounds, a knife for cutting away armor or clothing, and a wooden cup for giving water. That's it. That's your entire medical kit for venturing onto an active battlefield where men are still fighting, dying, and being trampled into the mud. Marjorie gives you a piece of advice that sounds darkly comedic. Stay low, move fast, and don't try to save the ones who are already mostly dead. The retrieval team consists of 6 people. You, 2 other medical assistants, and 3 soldiers designated as stretcher bearers. The soldiers look as unhappy about this assignment as you feel. They'd rather be fighting or resting, not hauling bleeding men across dangerous ground. You're all wearing strips of white cloth tied around your arms, supposedly marking you as non-combatants under some vague medieval understanding of battlefield courtesy. Whether enemy soldiers will respect this marking is anyone's guess. The battlefield is maybe half a mile from the camp, and you can hear it before you see it. The clash of metal on metal, the shouting, the screaming, and underneath it all, a lower sound like a constant moan rising from the earth itself. As you crest a small hill, the full horror sprawls before you. Hundreds of men are engaged in scattered combat across a muddy field. Bodies lie everywhere, some still, some moving weakly, some crawling toward safety that's too far away to reach. Your job is to move through this chaos, identify wounded men who might survive if treated, and drag them back to the camp. The key word is might survive. You're not here for the obviously dying or the lightly wounded who can walk on their own. You're looking for the middle category. Men who'll die without help but could live with intervention. Here's where it gets complicated. You have to make these assessments while arrows are occasionally flying overhead, while horses are charging through the mud, potentially trampling anyone in their path, while the battle lines shift and surge unpredictably. There's triage under fire, and every decision has to be made in seconds because staying in one place too long means becoming a casualty yourself. The first wounded man you reach is lying face down in mud mixed with blood. You roll him over. He's still breathing barely, with an arrow in his back that's penetrated deep. His eyes flicker open when you move him, and he tries to speak but only manages a wet, gurgling sound. Punctured lung, probably. You signal the stretcher bearers, and they hustle over, hauling him onto the canvas stretcher with practiced efficiency. That's one. 20 feet away, another man is sitting upright, staring at his own entrails spilling from a sword wound across his abdomen. He's trying to push them back inside, his hands slick with blood and intestinal contents. You've seen enough gut wounds by now to know this one's hopeless. Even if you got him back to camp immediately, even if Thomas worked miracles, an abdominal wound this severe with the intestines exposed and contaminated is a death sentence. You move past him, and his eyes follow you with a look that's more confused than angry, like he can't understand why you won't help. Here's a quirky historical detail. Medieval soldiers sometimes survived gut wounds by having the wound cauterized immediately on the battlefield, sealing everything, intestines included, inside the body cavity with scar tissue. It was agonizing, usually led to massive infections, and had maybe a 5% survival rate, but that was 5% better than the alternative. Nobody's offering that treatment today, though. The battlefield surgeons are back at camp, and you're just here to collect the salvageable. An arrow hisses past your head, close enough that you feel the air displacement. You drop instinctively, pressing yourself into the mud next to a corpse that's already cold and stiff. The archery is supposed to have stopped. There's supposed to be a lull in the fighting, but nobody told that to whoever just shot at you. The white cloth on your arm means nothing to an archer who sees movement and shoots reflexively. You crawl toward a man who's screaming, his leg bent at an impossible angle from a horse trampling. The leg is shattered but not amputated, and he's young and strong, salvageable if you can get him back. You tie a rough tourniquet above the break using a strip of cloth, cutting off most of the blood flow, and wave for the stretcher bearers. They're busy with another casualty, so you have to wait, crouched next to this screaming man, trying to offer useless comfort while staying alert for threats. A mounted knight thunders past, his horse's hooves missing you by inches. The ground shakes with the impact, and mud splatters across your face. The knight doesn't even notice you. He's focused on an enemy somewhere ahead, his lance lowered for impact. If he'd veered slightly left, you'd be a red smear in the mud, a civilian casualty of a battle that's supposedly winding down. The stretcher bearers finally arrive, and you move to the next casualty. This one's an archer with his hand partially severed by a sword stroke, 3 fingers hanging by skin, blood pumping rhythmically from the wounds. He's conscious and relatively calm, probably in shock. You pack the hand with cloth and help him to his feet. He can walk, so you send him stumbling toward camp on his own. He'll either make it or he won't, but at least he's mobile. Here's a mainstream fact about medieval battlefield retrieval. It was incredibly dangerous work, often done by the lowest status camp followers and impressed civilians. The mortality rate among retrieval teams was significant. You could easily become a casualty while trying to rescue casualties. But armies needed the practice because trained soldiers were valuable, and recovering wounded veterans meant preserving military experience and skill. So they sent out teams like yours, equipped with almost nothing, to scavenge their wounded from the killing field. You find a man trapped under a dead horse, still alive but pinned from the waist down. His face is purple from exertion, and he's been trying to free himself for who knows how long. It takes all 6 of you to lift the horse enough for him to drag himself out. His legs are crushed, obviously broken in multiple places, but he might survive with amputations. Onto the stretcher he goes. The mud is the worst part. It's not just mud. It's a slurry of blood, urine, feces, vomit, and decomposing flesh from previous battles fought on this same ground. Every step squelches, and you can feel things shifting under your feet that you don't want to identify. When you kneel to examine a casualty, the mud soaks through your clothes with a cold, clammy embrace. The smell rising from it is indescribable. Death and decay mixed with human waste and churned earth. A soldier grabs your ankle as you pass, his grip surprisingly strong. He's been run through with a spear that's still embedded in his chest, the shaft broken off short. He's somehow still conscious, and he's begging you to help him. You look at the wound. The spear entered below his ribcage and likely punctured his liver or stomach. Blood is trickling from his mouth. He has minutes, maybe hours if he's unlucky. You give him water from your cup and move on. His curses follow you, and you try not to think about the fact that you've just condemned him to die alone in the mud. Here's what historians still argue about: whether battlefield retrieval actually improved survival rates or just prolonged suffering. Some wounded men might have died relatively quickly on the field from blood loss or shock, but instead were dragged back to camp where they died slowly from infection or surgical complications. Others genuinely benefited from rapid treatment. The overall calculus is murky, dependent on injury type, retrieval speed, treatment quality, and dozens of other variables that nobody tracks systematically. You're working your way across the field methodically, and the casualty count is mounting. The stretcher bearers are making multiple trips, shuttling wounded back to camp and returning for more. You've developed a grim efficiency. Approach, assess, mark, or retrieve, move on. Don't linger. Don't overthink. Don't let yourself process what you're seeing, because if you start really thinking about it, you'll freeze up and become useless. A group of enemy soldiers appears suddenly over a ridge, and everyone drops flat. You're on the wrong side of your army's lines in contested territory, and if these soldiers decide you're valuable captives or just convenient targets, you're finished. They survey the field, ignore the retrieval team as beneath their notice, and move on hunting for active combatants. You've been spared by the medieval equivalent of being too insignificant to bother with. You find a knight in expensive armor who's been knocked unconscious, blood trickling from under his helmet. He's clearly high status. His armor alone is worth more than most soldiers will earn in their lifetimes. You check his breathing, steady, and signal frantically for the stretcher bearers. He gets priority treatment, rushed back to camp immediately, because nobility has value even when unconscious in the mud. The common soldier 10 feet away with similar injuries will have to wait. The battlefield is a snapshot of medieval warfare's brutality. Bodies in various states of dismemberment, men dying slowly from wounds that won't kill for hours, horses screaming with broken legs, weapons embedded in corpses, armor dented and split, blood soaking into earth that's seen this same scene dozens of times before. This field has been fought over repeatedly, and each battle adds another layer of trauma to the soil. You're dragging a wounded man by his arms. He's too heavy for you to lift, so you're just hauling him through the mud toward the retrieval point. He's semi-conscious, groaning with each jolt, leaving a trail of disturbed mud behind him. This isn't dignified or professional medical transport. It's desperate scavenging of human debris from a killing field. An arrow thuds into the ground inches from your hand, and you abandon the man you were dragging to throw yourself flat. The archery has started again, which means the battle is resuming or never really stopped. The retrieval team leader is shouting to fall back, that it's too dangerous to continue. You've been out here for maybe 2 hours and collected perhaps 15 wounded men. Hundreds more lie scattered across the field, and many of them will die before the next retrieval opportunity. As you retreat toward camp, you pass a young boy, maybe 12 years old, who was serving as a page or squire. He's been nearly cut in half by a sword stroke, his body almost separated at the waist. He's somehow still breathing, still conscious, looking at you with wide, terrified eyes. There's absolutely nothing you can do. His injuries are incompatible with life, and he's dying as you watch. You kneel next to him for just a moment, taking his hand, and stay until his eyes go blank. It's the only mercy you can offer. Back at the camp perimeter, you collapse, shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion and horror. You've been on the battlefield for a fraction of the time soldiers spend there, and you're destroyed by it. The men you retrieved are being processed into the tent, adding to the already overwhelming casualty load. Thomas glances at you and nods, acknowledgement that you survived your first battlefield retrieval. Here's the dark truth. You'll probably be sent out again tomorrow, or the day after, whenever the next battle pause allows for casualty recovery. This is part of the job now, venturing into active war zones with minimal protection to drag broken bodies back to a tent where most of them will die anyway. The battlefield retrievals continue as long as battles continue, an endless cycle of violence and desperate rescue attempts. You smell like mud and blood and death. Your clothes are ruined. Your hands are cramped from dragging bodies. Your mind is full of images you'll never unsee. Men begging for help you couldn't provide. Boys dying in mud. The casual way soldiers step over corpses like they're rocks in a stream. Welcome to battlefield retrieval in medieval warfare, where you're expected to walk into hell, cherry-pick the salvageable souls, and walk back out before the chaos consumes you too. The arrows and horses wait for no one, and your white cloth armband is a suggestion of protection rather than a guarantee. You're sitting outside the tent in a rare moment of stillness, watching Thomas stitch up a facial wound while he explains his reasoning aloud. The wound is on the left side of the face, see? That corresponds to an excess of black bile, which governs the spleen and melancholy. We must balance this with bloodletting from the right arm to draw the humors across the body and restore equilibrium. He says this with complete conviction, and the patient nods along as if it makes perfect sense. This is your introduction to the theoretical framework that governs every decision made in the medic tent, the doctrine of the four humors. According to this system, which has dominated Western medicine since ancient Greece, the human body contains 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health means these humors are in balance. Disease means they're out of balance. Every treatment, every diagnosis, every prognosis is interpreted through this lens that's completely, fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. Blood is hot and wet, associated with air, the heart, and sanguine temperament. Phlegm is cold and wet, associated with water, the brain, and phlegmatic temperament. Yellow bile is hot and dry, associated with fire, the liver, and choleric temperament. Black bile is cold and dry, associated with earth, the spleen, and melancholic temperament. Got all that? Good, because medieval physicians spent years studying these relationships, memorizing complex correspondences between humors, organs, seasons, planets, and personality types. Brother Aldrich joins the conversation, adding his layer of understanding. The wound occurred on Tuesday under Mars's influence, which governs blood and warfare. The patient's humoral balance was already disrupted by the martial energy, making him susceptible to injury. We must account for the planetary influences in our treatment. He's completely serious about this. Astrology and medicine are inseparable in the medieval worldview. Here's where it gets even more complicated. Different times of year require different treatments because the seasons affect humoral balance. Spring is hot and wet, increasing blood, so spring illnesses require bloodletting. Summer is hot and dry, increasing yellow bile, so you treat with cooling foods and purges. Fall is cold and dry, increasing black bile, requiring warming treatments. Winter is cold and wet, increasing phlegm, so you use drying and heating remedies. The treatment for the exact same wound changes based on what month it is. Thomas is now explaining why he chose to stitch rather than cauterize this particular facial wound. The face is governed by multiple humors, the eyes by water, the nose by air, the mouth by fire. A wound crossing these boundaries requires delicate balancing. Cautery would introduce too much fire element, potentially scorching the watery eye humor and causing blindness. Stitching allows the natural healing heat to develop gradually without overwhelming the local humoral balance. It's almost impressive how wrong it is while sounding internally consistent. Medieval medicine created an entire elaborate theoretical structure that explained everything and predicted nothing useful. Treatments worked or failed randomly because they weren't addressing actual disease mechanisms, but the theoretical framework was flexible enough to explain any outcome after the fact. A patient with a festering wound is brought in, and Marjorie examines the discharge. Yellow pus. See how it's thick and hot? That's yellow bile escaping from the body, which is good. We want to encourage that. Green pus, though, that's a mixing of humors that shouldn't mix, which means corruption. She's actually partially right by accident. Thick yellow pus, indicating certain bacterial infections, sometimes correlates with better outcomes than thin, watery discharge. But she's right for completely wrong reasons. Brother Aldrich has his own diagnostic method, examining the patient's urine. He holds up a flask of cloudy yellow liquid, studying it against the light like a sommelier evaluating wine. See the sediment and the cloudiness? This indicates excess heat and dryness, probably yellow bile accumulating in the kidneys. We'll need cooling treatments, cucumber water, lettuce, cold compresses. Uroscopy, diagnosis by urine examination, was a cornerstone of medieval medicine, and physicians developed elaborate charts showing different urine colors, consistencies, and smells that supposedly revealed internal imbalances. Here's a quirky detail. Medieval physicians sometimes tasted the patient's urine. Sweet-tasting urine indicated diabetes mellitus, literally honey sweet passing through, though they interpreted this as a humoral imbalance rather than a metabolic disorder. They stumbled onto a genuine diagnostic sign but misunderstood its significance completely. Thomas is treating a fever patient, and he's consulting an astrological chart to determine the best time for bloodletting. Mars is ascending, which intensifies hot humors. We should wait until the moon enters a water sign. That'll be tomorrow afternoon. Then bleed him to release the excess heat under cooling celestial influences. The patient lies fevered and delirious while his physician calculates planetary positions to decide treatment timing. You watch as they prepare to bleed the fever patient according to the astrological schedule. Thomas makes a small incision in the patient's arm, not near the infected wound, but on the opposite side of the body because of humoral correspondence theories, and lets blood drain into a bowl. They're taking maybe 8 ounces, which doesn't sound like much until you remember this man is already weakened by fever and fighting an infection that's consuming his body's resources. The blood is too dark, Thomas observes, examining the bowl. Black bile mixed in, see? The melancholic humor is contaminating the sanguine. We'll need to purge his bowels tomorrow to expel the black bile from below while we've released corrupted blood from above. two-pronged balancing approach. He's literally planning to weaken this dying man further by draining him from both ends. Marjorie has her own diagnostic tradition that's more practical but equally based on flawed theory. She examines a wound's smell, color, heat, and discharge to determine which humor is corrupting it. This one smells sweet and foul, that's black bile putrefying. We'll pack it with bitter herbs to counteract the excess earth element. Some of her herbal choices actually have antimicrobial properties, so occasionally her treatments help despite the reasoning being nonsense. Here's a mainstream fact that explains why humoral theory persisted for so long. It was a complete system that explained everything in ways that felt logical within its own framework. Disease, personality, weather, emotions, food, treatment, everything fit into the humoral model. When treatments failed, you could always explain it as the humors being more imbalanced than initially assessed, or planetary influences being stronger than anticipated, or the patient's constitution being too weak. The theory was unfalsifiable, which made it resilient against contrary evidence. Brother Aldrich is now explaining the spiritual dimension of humoral medicine. The four humors mirror the four elements of creation: earth, air, fire, water, which God created in perfect balance. Sin disrupts this divine balance, allowing humors to become disordered. Thus, confession and prayer are essential medical treatments, restoring spiritual balance which allows physical balance to follow. For him, treating the body without treating the soul is incomplete medicine. You're watching Thomas examine a head injury patient, and his diagnostic process is fascinating in its wrongness. He's checking the patient's pulse at different points, wrist, neck, temple, and claiming he can feel the quality of different humors through pulse character. The pulse is rapid and hard, that's choleric excess, yellow bile overheating the blood. We'll cool him with cucumber and lettuce poultices, and perhaps bloodlet from the left foot to draw heat downward away from the head. The patient has a skull fracture and brain swelling. He needs pressure relief and prevention of infection. Instead, he's getting vegetables strapped to his head and bloodletting from his foot based on a theory about moving heat around his body through vascular pathways that don't work the way medieval physicians think they do. Marjorie teaches you about food as medicine, which is actually one area where medieval practice occasionally aligned with reality. Hot, moist foods like chicken broth strengthen the blood. Cold, dry foods like barley cool choleric fevers. Garlic is hot and dry, good for phlegmatic complaints. Some of this is accidentally nutritionally sound. Sick people do benefit from broth's easy calories and hydration, but the reasoning is all about humoral balancing rather than nutritional biochemistry. Here's what historians still argue about. Did humoral theory actually harm patients more than help them? Some argue that by providing a framework for treatment, it at least motivated caregivers to try interventions, some of which worked by chance. Others argue that systematic bloodletting, purging, and other humoral treatments actively killed patients who might have survived with no intervention. The debate continues because medieval outcome data is essentially non-existent. Thomas is consulting a thick manuscript, one of the few medical texts available, that contains diagrams of the human body with humoral correspondences marked. The liver produces yellow bile. The spleen produces black bile. The brain produces phlegm. The heart produces blood. These aren't descriptions of actual organ function, but rather statements of humoral theory presented as anatomical fact. The illustrations show a human body that's more symbolic than accurate, with organs sized and positioned according to their humoral importance rather than their physical reality. A patient asks why his wound isn't healing, and Thomas has an answer ready. You were wounded during a full moon, which draws humors upward in the body like tides. The lunar influence is pulling blood and phlegm toward the wound site, preventing proper closure. As the moon wanes, the wound should improve. The actual reason the wound isn't healing is bacterial infection, but the patient accepts the lunar explanation because it fits the prevailing worldview. Brother Aldrich adds his interpretation. Also, it's autumn, the season of black bile and melancholy. Your natural healing capacity is diminished because your constitutional humor is out of phase with the seasonal humor. We must wait for humoral alignment or force balance through aggressive treatment. Everything moon phases, seasons, time of day, patient's age, and temperament gets factored into this elaborate pseudoscientific system. You're starting to understand that medieval medicine is a complex edifice built on a foundation of nonsense. The practitioners are intelligent, observant, and genuinely trying to help. They've accumulated practical knowledge through experience. But their theoretical framework is so wrong that it actively impedes progress. They're looking at human physiology through a lens that distorts everything, making patterns where none exist and missing the actual mechanisms of disease and healing. Thomas explains his surgical decisions through humoral theory. We amputate above the corrupted area to remove all tissue contaminated by disordered humors. The saw's heat generates local fire element, which cauterizes while cutting. The pain itself is therapeutic, hot and dry, driving out cold and wet phlegmatic corruption. He's turned amputation into a humoral balancing act, finding theoretical justification for what's actually just pragmatic removal of dead tissue. A patient dies, and the death is immediately interpreted through the humoral lens. His black bile was too dominant, Thomas concludes. The melancholic humor overwhelmed the vital heat of blood. Even if we bled him more aggressively, the cold, dry nature of his constitution would have extinguished his life fire. This explanation satisfies everyone. The death makes sense within their worldview. Nobody questions whether the bloodletting itself hastened his death. Here's the chilling reality. Every decision in this tent is based on a medical theory that's completely divorced from biological reality. The few treatments that work do so despite the theory, not because of it. The many treatments that harm patients are logically consistent with humoral principles. Medieval medicine is a perfectly coherent system that bears almost no relationship to how human bodies actually function. And yet they're so confident, so certain in their knowledge. Thomas has spent years studying humoral correspondences. Brother Aldrich has memorized the relationships between planets, elements, and bodily fluids. Marjorie knows the humoral properties of dozens of herbs. They're experts in a fictional version of medicine, masters of a science that doesn't exist. This is the surgeon's medieval mind. Brilliant, observant, dedicated, and trapped in a theoretical framework so fundamentally wrong that it guarantees most of their efforts will fail. They're trying to help. They're just using a map that shows a completely different territory than the one they're actually navigating. You've been in the medic tent for a week now, and something inside you has broken. Not dramatically. There was no single moment of collapse, but rather a gradual erosion, like water wearing away stone. You find yourself standing over a patient who's screaming as Thomas saws through his femur, and you feel nothing. The sound that would have horrified you 7 days ago is now just background noise. You've become numb, and that numbness terrifies you more than the blood ever did. The psychological toll of medieval battlefield medicine is something nobody warned you about because nobody here thinks in terms of psychological trauma. These people don't have words for PTSD, compassion fatigue, or moral injury. They live in a world where suffering is ubiquitous, where death is commonplace, where horror is just Tuesday afternoon. But you're not from this world, and your modern mind is buckling under pressures it was never designed to withstand. You've stopped sleeping properly. When you do manage to drift off on your pile of straw, you dream of the battlefield. The boy cut nearly in half, the man trying to push his intestines back inside, the archer who died on the table during his second amputation. The dreams blend with waking reality until you're not sure what you actually witnessed and what your traumatized brain invented. You wake up gasping, covered in cold sweat, and immediately have to return to work because the wounded don't stop coming just because you're psychologically disintegrating. The smell has become part of you. You can't escape it even when you step outside for air. It's in your clothes, your hair, your skin. You've tried washing in the stream, but the water is contaminated with battlefield runoff, so you're essentially bathing in diluted blood and death. The smell follows you everywhere, a constant olfactory reminder of where you are and what you're doing. Sometimes you catch yourself gagging over meals, unable to eat because everything smells like the tent. Here's a mainstream historical fact that explains why you're falling apart. Medieval people had different psychological resilience than modern people, not because they were tougher, but because their entire worldview was constructed to accommodate constant suffering. They believed death was a transition to eternal life. They believed suffering had spiritual meaning. They believed gods will govern everything, which meant accepting horror as divine plan. You have none of these psychological defense mechanisms, which means you're absorbing the full impact of medieval warfare's brutality without any buffer. Marjorie notices you're struggling. She pulls you aside during a brief lull and speaks quietly. "You're thinking too much," she says. "I can see it in your face. You're trying to save them all, trying to understand why they die, trying to make it mean something. Stop. You're a pair of hands. Do the work. Don't think about the work. That's how you survive." She's describing dissociation as a coping mechanism, the psychological splitting where you separate your actions from your emotional responses. Medieval caregivers apparently discovered this technique through brutal experience. Don't engage emotionally. Don't see patients as individuals with families and futures. See them as tasks. This wound needs stitching, that limb needs removing, move on to the next. It's psychologically devastating in the long term, but in the short term, it keeps you functional. You try to adopt her approach, but it doesn't work. Your modern mind rebels against dehumanizing patients. You keep seeing them as people. The knight who kept asking about his horse, the young soldier who cried for his mother, the archer who understood his life was over the moment he lost his arm. Each one registers as an individual tragedy, and the cumulative weight is crushing you. Thomas has his own coping mechanism: dark humor. He makes jokes while sawing through bones, comments sarcastically on the absurdity of injuries, laughs at the futility of treatment. "This one's missing half his intestines," he might say cheerfully. "Let's stuff the rest back in and see what happens." It sounds callous, but it's his way of maintaining emotional distance from work that would otherwise drive him insane. The laughter is armor. Brother Aldrich copes through faith. Every death is God's will. Every survival is divine mercy. The suffering has meaning in a cosmic framework you can't see. He prays constantly, finding comfort in the belief that he's facilitating God's plan rather than helplessly watching people die. His faith is unshakable because he needs it to be. Without it, he'd have to confront the meaningless randomness of who lives and who dies, and that might destroy him. Here's a quirky historical detail. Medieval caregivers had shockingly high rates of what we'd now recognize as alcoholism. They drank heavily, wine, ale, anything available, to numb themselves to the daily horror. It wasn't recognized as a problem because everyone drank heavily, but the pattern of using alcohol to manage trauma was clearly present. Thomas is rarely completely sober. Marjorie drinks steadily throughout the day. Even Brother Aldrich takes wine for medicinal purposes more often than seems strictly necessary. You're starting to understand why. The intrusive thoughts are becoming unmanageable. You'll be changing a bandage and suddenly remember the boy on the battlefield, dying slowly while you held his hand. You'll be eating a piece of bread and flash back to the smell of burning flesh. You'll hear screaming and your heart will race, your hands will shake, your breathing will become rapid and shallow. Panic responses that make no sense when you're not in immediate danger but that your traumatized nervous system can't help producing. The moral exhaustion is worse than the physical exhaustion. You've made so many decisions about who receives treatment and who doesn't. You've walked past dying men to treat more salvageable cases. You've assisted in amputations you knew were futile. You've watched Thomas make treatment decisions based on social class rather than medical need. Each moral compromise adds weight to an internal burden you're not equipped to carry. A soldier grabs your arm during one of your rounds. "Will I live?" he asks, his eyes desperate. You look at his wound, deep abdominal stab with visible intestinal damage. You know he's going to die slowly and painfully. Medieval medicine offers him nothing. The truth would be devastating. A lie would be cruel when he discovers it's false. You settle for, "The physicians are doing everything they can." It's meaningless comfort, and he knows it, and you know he knows it, and you both pretend it's enough. Here's what historians still argue about: whether medieval caregivers experienced psychological trauma at rates comparable to modern medical personnel. Some evidence suggests they did. Records of caregivers becoming melancholic, withdrawing from work, or exhibiting behavior consistent with what we call burnout or PTSD. Other evidence suggests the cultural framework that normalized suffering provided genuine psychological protection. The debate continues, but you're living proof that someone with modern sensibilities can't handle medieval battlefield medicine without psychological damage. The death toll is mounting, and you've stopped counting. There's a corpse cart that comes through twice daily, and it's always full. You've given up trying to remember names or faces. There are too many, and they blur together into a mass of suffering humanity that your brain can't process individually. This is a psychological defense mechanism called psychic numbing, but it feels like losing your humanity piece by piece. Thomas finds you standing motionless in the middle of the tent, staring at nothing. "You're done," he says flatly. "You're no use to anyone like this. Go outside. Walk. Don't come back until you can function." He's not being cruel. He's recognizing that you've hit a psychological wall and need to step away before you become a liability. You stumble outside into weak sunlight. The camp spreads before you. Hundreds of tents, thousands of soldiers, the machinery of medieval warfare grinding on indifferently. You're one tiny person in an enormous system of violence, and nothing you do matters. The men you save today will probably die tomorrow in the next battle or from camp disease. The men who die today are already being replaced by fresh recruits marching into camp. The war continues regardless of individual suffering. This is the moment of moral collapse, where you confront the ultimate futility of what you're doing. You're not saving lives in any meaningful sense. You're temporarily prolonging some lives while failing to prevent most deaths. The tent isn't a hospital. It's a sorting facility that processes human beings damaged by violence and occasionally, almost accidentally, returns some of them to functional status. The rest die, and new wounded arrive to take their places. You sit down heavily on a log, your head in your hands. A camp follower walks by, sees your distress, and offers surprising wisdom. "First time working the tents?" You nod. "It gets better and worse," she says. "Better because you learn not to feel it so much. Worse because you realize it never ends. There's always another battle, always more wounded. This is just what war is." She walks away, leaving you with that bleak truth. Here's why you wouldn't last even this 1 week as a medieval battlefield medic. You still care. You're still seeing patients as individuals. You're still bearing the emotional weight of their suffering. You haven't developed the psychological calluses that would let you function indefinitely in this environment. Medieval caregivers either developed those calluses or they broke and left. There was no middle ground, no trauma counseling, no concept of self-care or emotional processing. The psychological demands are impossible. You need to be compassionate enough to want to help but detached enough to function when help fails. You need to make rapid triage decisions that condemn some men to death while knowing you might be wrong. You need to assist in procedures that cause agonizing pain for uncertain benefit. You need to watch people die daily while maintaining enough hope to bother treating the next patient. You need to live with the smell, the screams, the blood, the moral compromises, the accumulated trauma of witnessing suffering you're powerless to prevent. You can't do it. Not for a week, not for a day, not even for a full shift. Your modern psychological framework, which expects suffering to be minimized, which believes every life has equal value, which assumes medicine should reliably heal, is incompatible with medieval battlefield reality. You keep waiting for things to get better, for the chaos to settle, for the horror to become manageable. But it doesn't. This is just the baseline. This is normal. And that realization is breaking you. Marjorie comes outside to find you. Thomas needs help with an amputation, she says. You shake your head. You can't. You physically cannot make yourself go back into that tent and participate in more suffering. She studies your face and nods understandingly. Everyone breaks eventually, she says quietly. Some faster than others. Go to your quarters. Rest. Maybe tomorrow you'll be useful again. Maybe not. War doesn't care either way. She's right. The war doesn't care. The wounded keep coming whether you help or not. The infections spread whether you intervene or not. The surgeons amputate whether you assist or not. You're completely replaceable, a fact that's both liberating and devastating. You're not essential to this machine of violence and suffering. It will grind on without you. You walk away from the tent, and with each step, the guilt compounds. Men are dying while you flee. Thomas and Marjorie are overwhelmed while you abandon them. Your absence might mean someone dies who could have been saved. But you can't go back. Your psychological reserves are depleted. You have nothing left to give. This is why you wouldn't last a day in a medieval battlefield medic tent. Not because of the blood or the primitive medicine or the physical demands. You'd break psychologically, crushed under the weight of horror, futility, and moral compromise that medieval caregivers somehow learned to carry. They developed psychological adaptations through cultural conditioning and brutal experience. You have neither, which means the work would destroy you mentally long before it destroyed you physically. The tent continues its work without you. The screaming continues. The dying continues. The war continues. And you sit outside, broken, unable to help, a casualty of medieval medicine's psychological warfare against anyone foolish enough to care too much. This is the truth they don't tell you about historical suffering. It wasn't just physically brutal. It was psychologically annihilating. The people who endured it weren't stronger than you. They just had different coping mechanisms and different expectations. Dropped into their world with your modern sensibilities intact, you'd break almost immediately. You've lasted a week. That's already longer than you should have. But the cost has been your psychological well-being, your faith in meaningful intervention, and your ability to engage with suffering without being destroyed by it. You're done. You're finished. You wouldn't last another day. And the terrifying part is that nobody here finds this unusual. Welcome to the psychological breaking point, where you discover that the real horror of medieval battlefield medicine isn't what it does to bodies. It's what it does to minds. You're lying on straw now, staring at the canvas ceiling of your quarters as evening settles over the camp. The sounds of the medic tent drift through the air. Distant screaming, the clang of instruments, voices raised in urgency or despair. It all seems far away now, filtered through the fog of your psychological withdrawal. Your hands are clean for the first time in a week, but you can still feel the phantom sensation of blood drying on your skin. Brother Aldrich appears at the entrance to your shelter, his silhouette backlit by the dying sun. He doesn't speak immediately, just stands there as if deciding whether you're worth the effort of pastoral care. Finally, he sits down beside you with a heavy sigh. "The work continues," he says simply. "With you or without you. That's the nature of war. That's the nature of suffering. It continues. You want to defend yourself, to explain that you're not weak or cowardly. You're just human, just broken by things humans shouldn't have to witness." But Brother Aldrich raises a hand to stop you. "I'm not here to judge," he says. "I'm here because I've seen 100 people sit exactly where you're sitting now, wearing exactly that expression. Some return to the tent. Most don't. Either choice is acceptable to God." "How do you keep doing it?" you ask, your voice rough from disuse and suppressed emotion. "How do you walk into that horror every day and not fall apart?" Brother Aldrich considers this for a long moment. "I believe their suffering has meaning," he says finally. "That every pain, every death, every seemingly senseless tragedy is part of a divine pattern I cannot see but must trust exists. Without that belief, I would be where you are now." He pauses. "Perhaps your people have lost something important when they lost that certainty. Or perhaps you've gained something equally important in recognizing that suffering is simply suffering, not part of some cosmic plan." The conversation drifts into silence. In the distance, the corpse cart makes its evening rounds, wheels creaking under the weight of the day's dead. You count the squeaks, 1, 2, 3, 4, and stop counting because knowing doesn't help. Tomorrow the cart will make the same rounds. The next day, and the next, an endless procession of death that your week of labor barely dented. "I thought I could help," you whisper. "I thought my knowledge of modern medicine would let me save people that medieval medicine couldn't." "And did it?" Brother Aldrich asks, though his tone suggests he already knows the answer. "No. Everything I know is useless here. Antibiotics that don't exist. Surgical techniques that require tools and conditions you don't have. Understanding of infection that doesn't help when I can't stop the bacteria from spreading. I know why they're dying, and I'm completely powerless to prevent it." "Then you understand our position exactly," Brother Aldrich says with something that might be satisfaction. "We are all powerless before death. The difference is that we've made peace with that powerlessness. You're still fighting it, which means it's winning." He stands slowly, joints creaking. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow, decide if you're returning to the tent or not. Either way, the work continues. Men die, men live. The war grinds forward, and all our efforts are dust before God's wind." He leaves you with that cheerful thought, his footsteps fading into the evening chaos of the camp. You close your eyes and try to imagine returning to the tent. The thought makes your chest tighten with anxiety. You can't go back. Not tomorrow, not ever. You've seen too much, felt too much, failed too much. The medieval battlefield medic tent has defeated you thoroughly and completely. And here's the final, devastating truth. You lasted longer than most modern people would. A week of medieval battlefield medicine is an eternity when you're not psychologically equipped for it. Most people with your sensibilities would have broken on the first day, the first amputation, the first time they had to choose who lived and who died based on social class rather than medical need. The medieval world is a place where suffering is constant, where medicine is theater performed on biological stages we barely understand, where death is so commonplace it barely registers, and where the psychological tools needed to survive this reality are fundamentally incompatible with modern emotional frameworks. You were doomed from the moment you arrived, not by any personal failing, but by the simple fact that you're a product of a world where suffering is considered aberrant rather than normal. The screaming from the tent has stopped. Either all the patients have been treated or they've mercifully lost consciousness. The camp settles into its nighttime routine of small fires, quiet conversations, and the ever-present awareness that tomorrow brings fresh violence. You lie in the growing darkness, a broken observer of a broken world, counting the ways you've failed and finding the count too high to finish. This is why you wouldn't last a day in a medieval battlefield medic tent. Not because you lack skill or courage or dedication. You'd fail because you're fundamentally mismatched to the work, a modern consciousness trapped in a medieval nightmare, trying to apply 20th century ethics to 14th century reality, and being destroyed by the gap between what you believe medicine should be and what it actually is in this time and place. The tent will open tomorrow to fresh casualties. Thomas will saw through bones. Marjorie will pack infected wounds. Brother Aldrich will pray over dying men. The work continues as it always has, as it always will, until this particular battle ends and the army moves to create fresh horror elsewhere. But you won't be there. You've already left psychologically, if not physically. The medieval battlefield medic tent has claimed another casualty. Not a body this time, but a mind that couldn't withstand the relentless weight of suffering it was never designed to carry. Sweet dreams are impossible after what you've seen, but perhaps, eventually, there will at least be dreamless sleep. That's the best you can hope for now, the mercy of forgetting, even temporarily, the week you spent in humanity's worst workplace, watching medieval medicine fail again and again and again while you stood by, increasingly helpless, increasingly broken, until finally you just stopped. The canvas ceiling blurs as your eyes finally close. Tomorrow's horrors can wait. Tonight, you've earned the right to disappear into whatever rest you can find, knowing that the screaming will continue without you, that the dying will proceed on schedule, that your absence changes nothing except the precise count of who bears witness to the suffering. You wouldn't last. Nobody with your worldview would. And that's not weakness, it's just the truth of what happens when incompatible realities collide.